내외 귀빈 여러분 안녕하십니까? 지금부터 방송통신위원회와 정보통신정책연구원이 주최하는 제3회 지능정보사회 이용자보호 국제컨퍼런스를 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 저는 오늘 사회를 맡은 김혜미 국제회의 통역사입니다. 이제 벌써 3년째 본 컨퍼런스의 사회를 맡게 됐는데요. 올해도 이렇게 다시 만나 뵙게 되어서 정말 기쁘고 또 영광입니다. 참고로 이번 컨퍼런스에선 코로나19 방역 지침에 맞춰 국내외 연사분들께서는 온라인상으로 참여해 주시고 또 토론에 참여해 주실 좌장 및 국내 패널 분들께서는 현장에서 자리를 빛내 주실 예정입니다. 또 이곳 촬영 공간에서도 역시 코로나19 확산을 막기 위해 최소한의 인원이 참가하여 방역 지침을 철저하게 준수하며 이번 컨퍼런스를 진행하고 있습니다. 제3회 지능정보사회 이용자보호 국제컨퍼런스는 방송통신위원회 및 KTV 유튜브 채널을 통해 실시간으로 함께하실 수 있습니다. 또 한글 자막이 행사 시작 시점부터 종료 시점까지 계속해서 제공될 예정입니다. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're joining us online today. My name is Hemi Kim, and I'm going to be your MC for the 3rd International Conference on Ethics of the Intelligent Information Society, also known as ICEI 2021. Well, it's indeed my great honor and pleasure to serve as your MC for 3 years in a row by now, and it's very nice to meet you all, both online and offline. Thank you so much for joining us today, and welcome. Well, as you can see, the ICEI 2021 is being held as a hybrid conference in the presence of both online and offline participants to abide by the Republic of Korea's COVID-19 related safety measures. So our distinguished speakers from home and abroad will be joining us online today. And our honored moderator and panelists will be kindly joining us on site today to grace the occasion with their presence today. So please keep this in mind. And also here in our virtual studio, only the minimum number of people are joining us on site today to prevent the spread of the virus. And we are following COVID-19 related safety measures in a stringent manner. And finally, you can watch the entire program real-time today via the official YouTube channels of Korea Communications Commission and Korea TV or KTV. And Korean subtitles will be provided from the beginning till the end of our programs today for your own convenience. 인공지능과의 공존을 주제로 열리는 이번 컨퍼런스는 인공지능 등 지능 정보 기술 적용에 따라 변화하는 사회에 필요한 윤리적 고려 사항과 또 이용자 정책에 대한 국내외 전문가들의 발표와 토론으로 구성되어 있습니다. 간략하게 오늘 컨퍼런스의 프로그램을 소개해드리자면 먼저 한상혁 방송통신위원회 위원장님의 개회사와 권호열 정보통신정책연구원 원장님의 개회사로 개회식을 진행하고 첫 번째 세션에선 미국 메릴랜드 대학교 벤 슈나이더맨 교수님과 남아공 프리토리아 대학교 엠마 루트캄프 블롬 교수님께서 발표를 해주실 예정이고요. 또 두 번째 세션에선 독일 튜빙겐 대학교 미셸 플링크 교수님과 프랑스 파리 낭테르 대학교의 루시 글루젤 메테이에 교수님께서 발표를 해주실 예정입니다. 또 세 번째 세션은 건국대학교 황용석 교수님께서 준비해 주셨습니다. 세 개의 세션을 모두 마친 후엔 고학수 서울대학교 법학전문대학원 교수님을 좌장으로 모시고 국내외 패널 분들과 함께 종합 토론을 진행할 예정입니다. 오늘 국내외 다양한 곳에서 온라인상으로 참석해 주신 모든 분들께 진심으로 감사와 환영의 인사를 드리며 부디 오늘 마지막까지 함께 해주실 간곡히 부탁드립니다. Well, the 3rd International Conference on Ethics of the Intelligent Information Society, which is being held under the theme of Living in the Age of AI, is composed of presentations and discussions of diverse experts from home and abroad, and it aims to cover the ethical implications and user policies in a fast-changing society with the application of intelligent information technologies such as AI. And to give you a brief outline of today's conference, first of all, the Honorable Mr. Sang Hyuk-han, Chairman of the Korea Communications Commission, and the Honorable Mr. Ho Yeol-kwon, president of the Korea Information Society Development Institute, will commence the conference with their opening and welcoming speeches. And after that, session 1 will be composed of 2 presentations, which will be delivered by Professor Ben Schneiderman from the University of Maryland in the USA, and Professor Emma Rootkamp-Blom from the University of Pretoria in the Republic of South Africa. And then session 2 will consist of 2 presentations as well, which will be delivered by Professor Michel Flink from the University of Tübingen in Germany, and Professor Lucie Cluzel-Métayer from the University of Paris-Nanterre in France. And session 3 will be conducted by Professor Yong-Seok Hwang from Konkuk University. And after all 3 sessions come to an end, panel discussion will be conducted, which will be moderated by Professor Hak-Soo Ko from Seoul National University's School of Law, featuring diverse panelists from home and abroad. So once again, we would like to express our sincere appreciation to all participants who are joining us online and offline today, and we sincerely hope that you will stay with us until the very end of our programs today. Thank you very much. 네, 그럼 지금부터 인공지능과의 공존을 주제로 개최되고 있는 제3회 지능정보사회 이용자보호 국제컨퍼런스를 본격적으로 시작하겠습니다. 먼저 오늘 컨퍼런스는 한상혁 방송통신위원회 위원장님의 개회사로 시작하겠습니다. So without further ado, let us begin the 3rd International Conference on Ethics of the Intelligent Information Society, which is being held under the theme of Living in the Age of AI. And first of all, the Honorable Mr. Sang-hyuk Han, Chairman of the Korea Communications Commission, will virtually deliver his opening speech. So let's take a look. 그럼 지금부터 한상혁 위원장님의 개회사를 영상으로 만나보도록 하겠습니다. 여러분 함께 보시죠.
안녕하십니까. 방송통신위원회 위원장 한상혁입니다. 제3회 지능정보사회 이용자보호 국제컨퍼런스를 시작하겠습니다. 이 행사는 2019년 신뢰를 위한 AI를 주제로 처음 개최되었습니다. 올해는 논의를 더 발전시켜 인공지능과의 공존을 주제로 함께합니다. 먼저 발제와 토론을 맡아주신 국내외 전문가 여러분께 깊이 감사드립니다. 코로나19로 인해 우리 생활은 크게 달라지고 있습니다. 그 변화의 중심에는 인공지능, 빅데이터와 같은 지능정보 기술이 존재합니다. 지능정보 기술은 우리의 삶을 보다 편하게 만들고 코로나 상황에서도 원활한 소통을 가능하게 했습니다. 그 중에서도 인공지능은 미디어, 의료, 법률 등 다양한 산업에서 미래의 핵심 기술로 자리 잡고 있습니다. 그러나 인공지능 시대의 삶이 긍정적인 것만은 아닙니다. 알고리즘의 편향성, 데이터의 주권 문제, 인공지능의 의사결정을 의존하게 되는 문제와 같은 부작용도 존재합니다. 건강한 인공지능 시대를 맞이하기 위해선 사람 중심의 지능정보사회에 대한 고민이 필요합니다. 유럽연합은 지난 4월 AI 법안을 제안하면서 사람 중심의 인공지능을 제도화하는 노력에 나섰습니다. 특히 인공지능이 이용자에게 미치는 위험의 정도를 구분하고 단계적으로 접근한 것은 이용자 보호를 위한 효율적인 규율체계로 평가할 수 있습니다. 방송통신위원회도 이용자 중심의 지능정보사회를 위한 원칙을 발표하고 올해 6월에는 인공지능 기반 미디어 추천 서비스 이용자보호 기본 원칙을 마련하였습니다. 앞으로 실행 지침 마련을 통해 산업의 혁신과 이용자 보호라는 정책 목표를 균형 있게 달성하고자 합니다. 하지만 현재 논의되고 있는 규율 체계를 제대로 마련하기 위해서는 지속적으로 발전하는 인공지능에 대한 정확한 이해가 수반되어야 합니다. 또한 정부와 기업의 역할 정립, 인공지능 활용 역량 강화와 같은 과제들도 남아 있습니다. 이러한 측면에서 오늘 다양한 논의를 진행하는 것은 매우 시의적절하다고 생각합니다. 국제적으로 논의 중인 인공지능 정책 제안의 의미를 살펴보고 정부, 기업, 시민의 역할을 숙고하는 공론의 장이 되길 기대합니다. 방송통신위원회는 여러분이 제안해 주신 다양한 고견이 이용자 보호 정책과 제도 발전으로 이어지도록 최선을 다하겠습니다. 마지막으로 오늘 행사를 위해 애써주신 정보통신정책연구원 권호열 원장님과 관계자 여러분, 그리고 이 자리에 참석해 주시고 지켜봐 주시는 모든 분들께 깊이 감사드립니다. 여러분의 건승을 기원합니다. 감사합니다.
네, 한상혁 방송통신위원회 위원장님께서 멋진 개회사로 오늘 컨퍼런스의 문을 활짝 열어주셨습니다. 감사합니다, 위원장님. Well, the Honorable Mr. Sang-hyuk Han, Chairman of the Korea Communications Commission, gave us an insightful opening speech. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. 네, 이어서 권호열 정보통신정책연구원 원장님의 환영사가 있겠습니다. And next, the Honorable Mr. Ho Yeol-kwon, President of the Korea Information Society Development Institute, will virtually deliver his welcome speech. So without further ado, let's take a look. 네, 이번에도 역시 영상으로 만나보도록 하겠습니다. 여러분 함께 보시죠.
안녕하십니까. 정보통신정책연구원 원장 권호열입니다. 인공지능 기술 확산에 따른 새로운 유형의 이용자 보호 이슈를 논의하고 관련 정책에 대한 국제사회의 공감대 형성을 목적으로 오늘 제3회 지능정보사회 이용자보호 국제컨퍼런스를 개최하게 되어 매우 기쁘게 생각합니다. 먼저 이번 컨퍼런스에 온 오프라인으로 참여하시는 국내외 귀빈 여러분, 그리고 함께해 주시는 청중 여러분께 환영과 감사의 말씀을 드립니다. 발제를 맡아주신 미국 메릴랜드 대학 벤 슈나이더맨 교수님, 남아공 프리토리아 대학 엠마 럿캠프 블룸 교수님, 독일 튜빙겐 대학의 미셸 핑크 교수님, 프랑스의 파리 낭테르 대학 루시 클루젤 메테이어 교수님, 그리고 건국대 황용석 교수님께 깊은 고마움을 표합니다. 또한 종합토론 좌장을 맡아주신 서울대 고학수 교수님, 토론자로 참여하시는 한국소비자연맹 강정화 회장님, 카이스트의 이수영 교수님, 연세대 김영찬 교수님, 고려대 이희정 교수님, 그리고 우리 연구원 권은정 박사님 등 전문가님들께도 감사의 말씀을 드립니다. 최근 지능정보기술과 인공지능으로 인한 변화는 전 세계 곳곳에서 빠르고 다양한 형태로 진행되고 있습니다. 특히 코로나 여파로 비대면 서비스의 확산이 급속도로 진행되면서 이용자 보호 정책의 중요성이 더욱 강조되고 있습니다. 그런 점에서 오늘 인공지능과의 공존, Living in the Age of AI를 주제로 인공지능의 발전과 함께 이용자들이 살아갈 조화로운 미래사회의 정책과 방향성에 대해 논의하게 된 것은 매우 뜻깊은 일이 아닐 수 없습니다. 지금까지 방송통신위원회와 정보통신정책연구원은 이용자가 지능정보기술을 안전하게 활용하는 한편 데이터 경제의 주체이자 통제자로서 역할을 할 수 있도록 이용자 역량의 향상을 위해 많은 노력을 해왔습니다. 오늘 컨퍼런스는 그간의 노력을 바탕으로 국가 간 경계를 뛰어넘어 다양한 분야의 전문가들과 이용자들이 서로의 경험과 가치를 공유하며 인공지능과의 공존 방안에 대해 논의하는 의미 있는 자리가 될 것입니다. 오늘 컨퍼런스가 참여하신 모든 분께 발표와 토론을 통해 함께 고민하고 연구할 수 있는 의미 있는 시간이 되길 바랍니다. 끝으로 오늘 행사를 준비해 주신 우리 연구원 조성은 박사님과 관계자들께 감사드리며 함께해 주신 모든 분이 건강과 행운을 기원합니다. 감사합니다.
네, 권호열 정보통신정책연구원 원장님께서 아주 뜻깊은 환영사를 전해주셨습니다. 원장님 감사합니다. Well, the Honorable Mr. Ho Yeol-kwon, President of Korea Information Society Development Institute, has just delivered a heartwarming welcome speech. Thank you very much. 네, 제3회 지능정보사회 이용자보호 국제컨퍼런스를 본격적으로 시작하기 전에 먼저 오늘 행사의 순서에 대해 간략하게 말씀드리겠습니다. 우선 국내외 연사 5분께서 진행해 주실 총 3개의 발표 세션이 준비되어 있습니다. 그리고 3개의 발표 세션 종료 이후엔 약간의 휴식 시간을 가진 후에 인공지능과의 공존을 주제로 국내외 전문가분들을 모시고 종합 토론이 진행될 예정입니다. 참고로 해외 영상 발표의 경우 화질이 다소 깨끗하지는 못한 점 미리 양해 부탁드립니다. Well, prior to the commencement of the third International Conference on Ethics of the Intelligent Information Society in earnest, let me give you a brief outline of today's conference first. First of all, we will conduct 3 sessions featuring a total of 5 presenters who will be delivering their presentations on different topics. And after 3 sessions come to an end, we will take a short break, and then we will have a panel discussion session under the theme of Living in the Age of AI, in collaboration with diverse experts from home and abroad. And for your information, the visual quality of our presentations from overseas participants will be slightly compromised due to long-distance connection issues, so please be understanding, and thank you very much in advance. 네, 그럼 지금부터 첫 번째 세션을 시작하겠습니다. 첫 번째 세션의 주제는 인간 중심의 인공지능입니다. So without further ado, let us begin session 1, titled Human-Centered AI. 그럼 세션 1의 첫 번째 발표를 들어보도록 하겠습니다. 첫 번째 발표는 인간 중심의 인공지능 새로운 통합을 주제로 미국 메릴랜드 대학교 벤 슈나이더맨 교수님께서 진행해 주시겠습니다. And the first presentation, titled Human-Centered AI, a New Synthesis, will be delivered by Professor Ben Schneiderman from the University of Maryland in the USA. So without further ado, let us virtually meet Professor Ben Schneiderman online. Professor Schneiderman, the floor is yours. 그럼 슈나이더맨 교수님의 첫 번째 발표 들어보도록 하겠습니다. 여러분 함께 보시죠.
Hello. I'm Ben Schneiderman from the University of Maryland in College Park, Maryland. Behind me is the Arib Building for Computer Science at the University of Maryland, and I'm very pleased and appreciative of this invitation to speak in Korea about ethics of AI systems. Today, we're looking to the future. Today, we're talking about human-centered AI. There's no question that artificial intelligence has had a dramatic set of breakthroughs and made very much progress in the past decade. It's widely used, and all around the world, the expectations are it will have great influence, which is why there's so much discussion about the ethical issues and responsible use of AI, humane and human-centered AI. And so for me, the idea of human-centered AI has 2 parts. It has a process. It has the set of tools, user experience design, of usability testing, of ways of assessing what users need and then providing for that by way of the principles and guidelines and strategies that we know improve the design. So for me, ethics is the foundation, and on top of it, we build with design because that tells us what the practice should be. The goal, what is the goal of human-centered AI? Amplify, augment, empower, and enhance what people can do. It's all about people. Yes, we need the good algorithms. Yes, we need to evaluate the performance of algorithms, but we also need to evaluate the performance and the impact on people. And that's my mission, that's my passion, and that's what I'm working on, and that's what I hope to convey to you today with 3 different ideas. We'll take a look first at the way we philosophically think about design. And I take you back 40 years to the ideas of Thomas Sheridan, who in 1980 defined the levels of automation. He defined 10 levels of automation. And the assumption was that you went from human control at level 0 or 1 to full computer automation at level 10. And the goal for designers was to choose some point of automation and control. And the assumption, the hidden assumption, the mistaken assumption was that if you increased automation, you must decrease human control. And that idea was something I bought into. And in the first edition of my book in 1986, I wrote about that idea. And I believed it to be true and thought you had to choose some point between human control and computer automation. But over the years, as I came to later editions, I began to be troubled by that notion. And so I shifted my, I shifted my thinking and my language, and I described the idea of ensuring human control while increasing automation. Now, the first time you hear that, the first time I wrote that, it was a bit of a puzzle. How would I do that? What did it mean? But I knew that human control was essential for successful commercial product. And what I came to understand is that there were really two separate scales, that you can have low or high human control and low or high computer automation, that actually you could deal with them independently if you broke down the design problem into a series of smaller problems. So the way I see this is now a two-dimensional pattern, that you have 4 quadrants for design. And what we really want are what I call reliable, safe, and trustworthy systems, like an elevator or a digital camera is my favorite example. The digital camera has a high degree of human control. The user points the camera at the picture, at the topic they want to photograph. They make the composition, they zoom in as they like, and then they click for their decisive moment. It's their photo. At the same time, AI and automation and machine learning are busy in the background. They're providing the focus. They're providing the lighting control. They're reducing hand jitter and making for a great picture. That combination is what we're talking about. High levels of human control for the things that people care about, that supports their creativity, and high levels of automation for the things that can be done reliably, safely, and in a trustworthy way by machines. That's the strategy, and we'll take a look at how to apply that. Elevators are the same idea, a high degree of machine learning in elevator systems, but we're in control. We press the button, the elevator arrives, the doors open, we go inside, we press the 16th floor, the doors close, and we see we go from 1 to 16, and we arrive. We feel in control, we feel safe, we know it's a reliable system, and it's become trustworthy because it's a mature system. So that's the goal for many designs. We must remember sometimes high levels of computer control are needed. Pacemakers embedded in patients' chests must operate automatically. But we'll see even that how that has changed. Airbags in the car must deploy in 200 milliseconds and must be automatic. Jet engines must operate with high degree of accuracy with changes every millisecond. We need automation for that. At the same time, there are also places we want a high level of human autonomy to support human mastery when riding a bicycle, playing a piano, taking care of children. We want to be in charge. We want to make mistakes. We want to be creative. We're responsible for what we do. And so there are times where you want high level of human mastery or human autonomy and control, but low automation. And of course, there's another quadrant that has low automation and low control. Now, notice in this diagram, there are 2 gray areas. On the far right side, we see the point of excessive automation. There's a danger of too much automation. We saw that in the Boeing 737 MAX, the tragedy of 2 airplane crashes, because the designers believed they could make a completely automatic system that they believed would be reliable. And that system failed. Yet, there was no display of that the system was engaged. There was no obvious way to shut it off. It was possible, but the pilots didn't think of it as they were in this tragic moment. And they tried 20 times to pull the airplane nose up, but whatever they did, these hidden automation drove the airplane down into the sea. So these tragedies were because of excessive automation. And that's one of the dangers we have to be really vigilant about. In fact, in that situation, the designers believed that they could be so successful, they did not even tell the pilots of the existence of this automated system. And as IBM says, hidden AI is irresponsible. So we need to make things visible. At the same time, there's a danger of excessive human control, that in many systems, humans can make mistakes, can do bad things. Interlocks and guards are a natural part of mature designs in many systems. For example, the self-cleaning oven. If the temperature goes above 500 degrees Fahrenheit, it's not possible to open the door because that, and so doing, it prevents a burning of the user. And so there are many systems which have these kind of interlocks or controls on them. And we need to be aware of the benefits of building those interlocks and controls and of making operators aware. Let's take a look at applying this concept to other tasks. So in a medical task for pain control, 70 years ago, the morphine drip bag was quite the standard. And it was a simple plastic bag, no automation. no user control. The morphine would drip at a regular pace and hopefully relieve patient pain. However, there were two dangers. One, too much morphine, which would kill the patient, and too little morphine, which would not relieve the pain. And so automatic dispensers were the first idea, and they measured human heartbeat and breathing rates, and therefore controlled the amount of morphine to limit the dangers. But it didn't deal with patient pain. And so the human control, patient-guided dispensers, the users got a trigger they could squeeze to get more morphine. But because too much morphine was a problem, they were prevented from having excessive control. The number of times they could squeeze per hour was limited, and the number of additional doses they could get. Modern systems are moving towards more patient-guided, clinician-monitored systems, which have a central control system in a control center in a hospital that might manage 50 of these devices to provide an overview, collect data, and aggregate it, and then use it to improve the design of future systems and improve the machine learning algorithms that might be applied. So that's how it works here. Let's take one more example from wheelchairs. Old-fashioned wheelchairs were very heavy, typically made of wood and steel, required someone to push the wheelchair person around. So there was no automation. The robotic devices became more automated, and they would move the patient around, but didn't always do the right thing. So lightweight, hand-guided, hand-powered wheelchairs became possible, and that led to creative outpourings of such things as basketball, wheelchair basketball and wheelchair race. And the newer devices have a stronger combination with a control center that might supervise hundreds or thousands of wheelchairs in the city and collect data about performance of all of them. So this kind of two-dimensional matrix has been very helpful to many people understand new design possibilities and to understand when human control is needed and when machine operation is necessary, and what are the dangers and how to prevent the dangers of excessive automation or excessive human control. And that's the end of the first idea. The second idea I present to you today is the idea of changing our way of thinking, changing our philosophy, our ethical patterns to move to a new direction that supports the idea of human control. The philosophy here is to change the language and the imagery and the metaphor. So the old language was of intelligent agents that were thinking machines, of teammates or partners or collaborators, of autonomy, autonomous systems that would operate on their own, and social robots that were like people, that they looked like people, they walked and they talked. This is popular still in many places, but I don't think it is the future. What I think is the future are what I call super tools that extend human abilities, AI-infused super tools, telebots that are remotely controlled steerable instruments, control centers that give human control and oversight, and then active appliance. The philosophy behind it, the ethical principles, are that robots are simply not people, says Margaret Bowden, British researcher. Humans, not robots, are responsible agents. Only humans are responsible. People are not computers, computers are not people. And every time someone attempts to blur the boundary, I think they're making a mistake. They're building suboptimal systems. It's much more effective to design a system that's a good technology, that's a super tool, than it is to have an autonomous system that operates on its own. And the 3 points are, first, responsibility. Only humans are reliable legally and morally for what happens with the use of these technologies. Furthermore, these technologies offer distinctive capabilities, such as sophisticated algorithms, huge databases, superhuman sensors, information abundant displays, and powerful effectors. And I worry that designers who are influenced by the idea of a social robot will forget that these are distinctive features, and we should be building technology that takes most advantage of those features. I believe in the specialness of human creativity, the passion, the empathy, the humility, and the intuition that people have. I don't think we want to build these into computers. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's wise. I think we want to build powerful super tools, telebots, control centers and active appliances. Let's take a look at a few. I've mentioned already the digital camera, a great super tool that gives tremendous human control as well as very strong machine learning AI support beneath, under the table behind the scenes. Users can choose different kinds of photos. They can take the photos, change the lighting, change the color, change many aspects, and they can easily share it with family and friends. That's the best news of a super tool. Digital navigation systems based on GPS operate the same way. The user decides where they are going. Here I've made a trip from the White House downtown to College Park, Maryland, to the university, just 8 miles away. And you can see the AI system with machine learning has offered 3 possible paths and estimates, predictions of the amount of time. The user gets to choose which one they want, and then they begin to use it. So again, we have a high degree of user control. Even once the machine, the digital navigation is put into play, users can change their path. They don't have to follow. They are in control over the system. And similarly for systems like text and search auto completion, I type in the search box, University of Maryland, and I get suggestions, and just as I get suggestions for spelling correction. That is the best combination. Human control with good recommendations and suggestions from. Here's a super tool that's enormously successful, the Bloomberg terminal. Bloomberg takes in 1.6 million articles every day and uses AI and natural language processing to organize, cluster, and present the information in a meaningful way that's comprehensible and tuned to the purpose of the user. The information abundant displays uses tiled, not overlapped windows and allows user control of them. The information is presented in ways that are related to the task that the users have and gives them exceptional control over what they see and then how they carry out the actions they want. The success is enormous. More than 300,000 people pay more than $20,000 a year to have this on their desk. And the idea of a Bloomberg terminal has been spreading to medical information, legal information, control rooms for transportation systems and utility companies and so on. The idea of lots of information will continue to gain strength, and we'll see more of those in a while. The active appliances are the ones in your house that are becoming infused with AI to be able to control these systems better, from your coffee maker to rice cooker, blenders and washers and dryers, and of course, thermostats and Roomba robots to clean your floor. All of these are ways that AI is combined to make a comprehensible, predictable, and controllable system. Another example of an active appliance is the pacemaker, which I mentioned before as an autonomous device. But that pacemaker embedded in your chest has now moved to be a controllable device where the client, the user, the patient gets to operate it and make adjustments to its operation. And at the same time, Medtronic Corporation gets to track the data from tens of thousands of users to continually improve the machine learning algorithms and to understand how failures do occur. So that's a combination of active appliances and control centers. The telebot idea is an example would be the Mars rovers. You'll hear many people talk about them being autonomous, and they are autonomous for things like moving along, avoiding obstacles, avoiding precipices, adjusting the solar panels, adjusting the antennas. All those operate quite autonomously. But at the same time, NASA has a control center with 80 people who operate the Mars rover, who decide what to do, who deal with problems that arise, and deal with the special opportunities that arise, which were unplanned or unexpected. And so this nice combination of teleoperated device and that has autonomy is the virtuous way that I think many devices should be built. Similarly, surgical operation devices are what I would call telebots. Da Vinci Surgical System says robots don't perform surgery. Your surgeon performs surgery with Da Vinci by using instruments that he or she guides via a console. It's a very powerful telebot that gives physicians and surgeons the capacity to make very precise movements deep inside human cavities without making severe surgical incisions. Just tiny incisions to allow the instruments to enter, and then they can move them gracefully with the controllers, the hand controls that they have here. That's the way I think we want to see future devices working. The control centers, here's a hospital one I mentioned already, and we see that in other utility companies, transportation, here a counterterrorism center, people working together, a great deal of information abundant displays, and the capacity for easy communication and shared work. So that's the second of the ideas. The third idea is that AI systems are embedded in complex socio-technical systems. And so we need governance structures to deal with them. And for me, the pattern is this one. There are 4 levels of governance that I would like to discuss. We'll only take part of it in this talk, but there's 5 recommendations for how software engineering teams should work together. And we'll be talking about some of those in depth. But there's also the way organizations, so companies may have dozens of software engineering teams, and they need to develop a culture of safety by way of management strategies that show leadership commitment to safety in hiring, in training, attention to failures and near misses, to internal reviews of problems that emerge, and to following industry standards. Safety culture is a whole topic in itself, and business managers are increasingly learning how to do that because it is a competitive advantage. Companies that adopt a safety culture can make safer products that ultimately are cheaper for them to operate and increase the profits of companies because they're more widely accepted. Injuries are less frequently part of the experience, and users wind up benefiting from them. At the level of industry, which contains many companies, so industries like medical care or transportation or military systems, we need to have trustworthy certification. And this is done by external reviews. Many companies will say, we have very good internal reviews. Yes, that's true. But the benefits of adding external reviews are great. And that's what I want to encourage. This will require new ways of thinking, but they really build on the ideas of financial auditing. Companies are required to do internal audits every year, but they're also required to have external audits from independent reviewers. And similarly, for influential AI systems, we need to have external oversight boards that can review what's happening. They bring expertise and skill by working with many different organizations. They then learn and bring the ideas that work for one company, they bring them to another company. Auditing firms like Ernst & Young, KPMG, PricewaterhouseCoopers, Deloitte are part of this world, and we see them acting already. Insurance companies are another oversight mechanism, very successful in building, in transportation, and in medical care. And I think they will play a role with AI systems also. For example, the insurance companies around the world are wrestling now with the question of how should they charge for insurance for self-driving cars, for highly automated cars? Should the Teslas of the world have a higher premium for purchasers or a lower premium? They don't know because they don't have the data. If you look on the website called tesladeaths.com, tesladeaths.com, you will be surprised to find, as I was, that there are more than 200 deaths with Teslas. We don't know how many of them were on autopilot, but it raises many questions, and we don't have the data. Tesla tells us their cars are safer than regular cars, but we don't really know. In the US, a month ago, National Highway Transportation Safety Administration launched an investigation of 11 accidents in which Teslas, while running on autopilot, ran into emergency vehicles on the road or on the side of the road, police, fire, and ambulance. And this turned out to be a serious problem with some deaths in these accidents. And so the investigation is proceeding, and I think we'll learn a lot from that. We do see other ways that industry certification is being done by professional societies and non-governmental organizations. So we see progress there, but government regulation has a role to play. Companies insist that government regulation will limit innovation, and there is a danger of that. However, I think the history shows it's possible to increase innovation, that when governments mandated and regulated and required higher fuel efficiency and safety, such as seatbelts, the companies came out with a huge set of innovations that made cars safer, more efficient. And now the companies are proud of those features and they see them as competitive advantages. Similarly, the European GDPR regulation, which guaranteed a right to explainability in AI systems, triggered a huge innovation in the AI field, more than 10,000 papers about explainability, and we'll be discussing that more. So I'll be brief. I can't cover all of this, but in this talk, I will focus on the team principles and the 5 recommendations. I'd like to just mention the audit trails for a moment, as in flight data recorders and cockpit voice recorders. These have been enormously effective in making very safe civil aviation. And the same idea of an audit trail for AI systems, or shall we say, a flight data recorder for every robot, can also make AI systems much safer. A related idea is the reporting through online websites for incident data. The Partnership on AI has already launched an AI incident database that has more than 1,000 incidents where AI has led to problems. And so that provides a lot of information about how we can design better systems. The other topics like the workflows, the validation and testing, and the bias testing are important issues, but I want to come for a moment only to talk about explainable AI. As I mentioned, the GDPR triggered a great deal of interest in explainable systems, and the general approach has been what are called retrospective explanations or post hoc explanations. These can be local, that is, they can describe for the particular case, mortgage granting, parole, hiring, and so on, what the decision was and why it went a certain way. Or they can be global explanations of how the system functions overall. So that's the discussion, but 98% of the papers use the retrospective post hoc approach. And I'm here to suggest a very bold idea, which is instead of fixing the confusion, you want to prevent the confusion and the surprise that comes. And that goal of prospective user interfaces, anti-hoc, it's called, is what I want to advocate here tonight. They should be interactive, visual, and allow exploration. You want to give users control of the explanation. So let's take a look at a simple example. This is a familiar one in this field, discussion about mortgage. In this case, I've reduced it to just 3 variables. The user is requested to put in the mortgage amount requested, the household monthly income, their liquid assets, and then they click and they get a report, and it says, we're sorry, your mortgage loan was not approved. You might be approved if you reduce the mortgage amount requested, increase your household monthly income, or increase your liquid assets. This is considered a pretty good post hoc retrospective explanation. However, it does not tell the user how much they need to reduce their mortgage request, how much they need to increase their household monthly income, or how much they need to increase their liquid assets. An alternative approach, which gives more user control, is to provide a set of sliders and give users control with this interactive exploratory interface. As they reduce the amount of mortgage requested, more blue appears and their score goes up closer to the green bar of what's needed to get approval. If they can increase their household monthly income, they get closer. If they can increase their liquid assets, maybe by borrowing money from a family member, they can get closer to the score needed for approval. And this kind of exploratory interface, again, this is a very simple example, but still a practical one that I hope conveys the idea, gives users control, lets them explore the sensitivity for each of the variables, which one makes a lot of difference, which one makes a little bit of difference. So I think these kind of interactive slider-controlled, user-operated devices could be helpful. And they've begun to go into use. This was a delightful one I found from some British librarians who made a recommender for novels. The users could select 4 sliders, from funny to serious, from beautiful to disgusting, from no sexual content to explicit sexual content, from optimistic to bleak. And as they move the slider, the covers they see change immediately. And that feedback lets them know why they got that recommendation. And that's what people really want. This idea has been used in news recommenders as well, where you might have 3 sliders for politics, entertainment, and sports. And as you move the slider for more politics, you get more recommendations of stories that deal with politics. If you want more sport, if you want all sports, you can get all sports recommendations. You are in control. The same thing is being put into place for movie recommenders and for music recommenders. Here, in this example, there's 5 of the 14 variables from Spotify: acousticness, instrumentalness, danceability, valence, and energy. And as the users move the sliders, the recommendations change immediately. And the OECD provides that for choices of better life index in different countries. And I've seen it for bank systems and so on. So I believe this idea of giving users control of machine learning recommender systems will help make these systems much more acceptable, much more comprehensible, predictable, and controllable. They support human control. Okay, so that's the story here. And my summary goes back to the 3 principles, the HCII framework that suggests we can have high levels of human control and high levels of computer automation. That's the goal for good design, while avoiding excessive automation and excessive human control. Secondly, we want to change the design metaphors. We want to move towards the idea of super tools. Let's call them AI-infused super tools, telebots, control centers, and active appliances. Those are the language, the metaphors, and the images that I'd like to see in future designs, because I think those are more likely to be commercially successful. And the third idea is the governance structures, the 15 recommendations. These were first published in an article in October 2020 in the ACM Transactions on Interactive Intelligent Systems. That paper has quickly become very popular and very much referenced. This is the set of papers, and you can see more on my website on human-centered-AI. All of this has led me to write a book, which will appear in January 2022 from Oxford University Press, called simply Human-Centered AI. If you want to keep in touch and learn more, join our Google group called simply Human-Centered-AI. Follow us on Twitter, Human-Centered AI, or visit the website hcai.site. And my closing message is, the future is human-centered. Thank you very much for your attention and your interest in this topic.
네, 벤 슈나이더맨 교수님 좋은 말씀 감사합니다. 벤 슈나이더맨 교수님께서는 오늘 발표 주제였던 인간 중심의 인공지능에 관한 신규 저서 Human-Centered AI를 집필 중이시고요. 이 책은 내년 1월 옥스퍼드 유니버시티 프레스에서 출간될 예정입니다. 자세한 사항은 저희 컨퍼런스 홈페이지를 참고해 주시기 바랍니다. Professor Ben Schneiderman from the University of Maryland in the USA has just delivered a very impressive presentation titled Human-Centered Human-Centered AI, A New Synthesis. Well, thank you very much, Professor Ben Schneiderman. And for your information, Professor Ben Schneiderman is writing a new book, as he mentioned in his presentation, titled Human-Centered AI, which was the main theme of today's presentation, and it will be released next year in January by the Oxford University Press. And for more information, please go to the official website of the Third International Conference on Ethics of the Intelligent Information Society. 네, 다음은 남아공 프리토리아 대학교 엠마 루트캄프 블롬 교수님의 두 번째 발표가 있겠습니다. 두 번째 발표의 주제는 인공지능 시대의 동맹으로서의 윤리입니다. Next, the second presentation, titled Ethics as Ally in the Age of AI, will be presented by Professor Emma Rootkamp-Bloom from the University of Pretoria in the Republic of South Africa. 그럼 엠마 루트캄-블롬 교수님의 발표 역시 저희가 영상으로 만나보도록 하겠습니다. So without further ado, let us hear from Professor Emma Rootkamp-Bloom. Professor Bloom, the floor is yours. 그럼 지금부터 두 번째 발표 들어보겠습니다. 함께 보시죠.
Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this very exciting conference. So in terms of the outline of my talk, I will say a few words about living in harmony in the era of AI. I will say something about the harms coming from AI technologies. Then I will discuss some of the principle-based AI ethics regulation intended as a way towards living in harmony with AI, and also some of its challenges. Then we will discuss responses to challenges faced by this kind of regulation, and I will do this in two groups, design-based responses and bottom-up approaches. Then I will introduce a new challenge to this kind of regulation in terms of value change in AI technologies, and I'll discuss the value-layered and value-infused nature of AI technologies. I will then end off by suggesting that ethics should be an ally on our way toward harmony in the era of AI. So in the UNESCO group that worked on the global recommendation on the ethics of AI, in the initial draft, we had a value that we called living in harmony and peace. And I would like to quote from that draft, just two paragraphs. AI actors should play an enabling role for harmonious and peaceful life, which is to guarantee an interconnected future, ensuring the benefit of all. The value of living in harmony and peace points to the potential of AI systems to contribute throughout their life cycle to the interconnectedness of all living creatures with each other and with the natural environment. The notion of humans being interconnected is based on the knowledge that every human belongs to a greater whole, which is diminished when others are diminished in any way. Living in harmony and peace requires an organic, immediate, uncalculated bond of solidarity, characterized by a permanent search for non-conflictual, peaceful relations, tending towards consensus with others and harmony with the natural environment in the broadest sense of the term. So this is my aim. But there are harms from AI technologies that may jeopardize such a harmonious life in the age of AI. These concerns, for instance, include concerns around human control, imperiling the most vulnerable groups in society, the quality of human interaction and agency, amplification of inequality, threats to social justice and political stability, to the environment and ecosystems, and also the quality and integrity of information. There are also specific harms from machine learning. Kate Crawford in 2017 identified two. Firstly, representation harm that relates to confirming subordination of certain social groups, which is a cultural or social harm based on identity prejudice and difficult to quantify. And then also a resulting transactional allocation harm relating to allocation of economic goods and resources, also based on some kind of structural bias. I want them to introduce also here a new consideration of harm, which is harm to the integrity of human moral values in terms of value change or manipulation. So principle-based regulation in response to these harms really exploded in the past few years. At the moment, there are more than 160 sets of policies, and they vary across different regions and institutions. That some are intergovernmental, some are national, some are professional, but there are a lot. And they all have one thing in common, which is that they are almost all ineffective. Some of the reasons for this may be that there is a lack of mechanisms for AI ethics to reinforce its own normative claims. There is a lack of distributed responsibility, and very few policies include directives on oversight and compliance mechanisms. Policies contain lofty ideas coming from outside the tech community. The focus is on what should be regulated, not how ethical concerns should be addressed by the tech community. There is a lack of feeling of moral accountability on the side of software developers because they lack comprehension and knowledge of long-term social consequences or skills to analyze the origin, nature, and manifestation of social power in society. And then there is a distinct lack of sensitivity for the fact that most of these policies are generated in the North. The result of this ineffectiveness are ethics shopping, blue washing, lobbying, dumping, and shirking, all relating to somehow watering down the ethical considerations in these policies. So some actions to mitigate this ineffectiveness have been suggested. They include warnings about the gap between the tech community's reality and lofty AI ethics ideals, getting guidelines to converge on a small set of principles, developing compliance tools and mechanisms, collating best practice examples and encouraging impact assessment, encouraging inter, multi, and transdisciplinary collaboration. And now I want to discuss also some deliberate suggestions to mitigate this ineffectiveness before considering a final concern not yet adequately addressed by current AI ethics policies. So the approaches I will look at will be ethics by design and bottom-up regulation. In terms of ethics by design, the first approach that I will consider is focusing on the how and not the what of AI ethics. This implies advocating for and suggesting hands-on concrete suggestions for ethical machine learning from within the machine learning community in terms of technical methods of addressing concerns around bias, transparency, and accountability. Morley et al. Write that enabling the so-called dual advantage of ethical machine learning so that the opportunities are capitalized on whilst the harms are foreseen and minimized or prevented requires asking difficult questions about design, development, deployment practices, users, as well as the data that fuel the whole life cycle of algorithms. The focus here is on developing translational tools to address ethical concerns in design and development phases of AI systems. Related is the rise of critical machine learning with its emphasis on ensuring the fairness, accountability, and transparency of machine learning systems in general, but specifically of autonomous decision-making systems powered by the newest deep neural network research and technology. And ethics by design projects then overlap in many important respects with these initiatives. So the next two design projects that I want to look at are AI for social good and then ethically aligned design. So in terms of AI for social good, the idea here is that well-designed AI is more likely to serve the social good, as designing AI for social good has the potential to address existing social problems effectively through the development of AI-based solutions. This is often focused on promoting health, contributing to sustainability goals such as food security, and creating opportunities for marginalized communities to participate in the global economy. In terms of value-aligned design, this is the notion that an ethical human-centric AI must be designed and developed in a manner that is aligned with the values and ethical principles of a society or the community it affects. The IEEE General Principles for Ethically Aligned Design are human rights, well-being, accountability, transparency, and awareness of misuse. Their objectives are to promote personal data rights and individual access control, while being promoted by economic effects, which relates to connectivity, legal frameworks for accountability, transparency and individual rights, and policies for education and awareness. This project is founded on classical ethics, so aligning with existing ethical traditions rather than building ethics into the system. Also on well-being metrics, embedding values into autonomous systems, but aligning with these values and methodologies to guide ethical research and design. They warn that, however, the full benefit of these technologies will be attained only if they are aligned with our defined values and ethical principles. We must therefore establish frameworks to guide and inform dialogue and debate around the non-technical implications of these technologies. And that brings us to the bottom-up approaches. The first one that I want to look at is AI ethics activism. Data activist research is a strong example of machine learning practitioners taking action to respond to and mitigate ethical concerns in terms of autonomous AI systems. This kind of research may offer a way in which to actionalize AI ethics regulation bottom up, or at least of anchoring its abstract principles in the real world more firmly. Let us first consider the notion of data activism. Kazansky et al. Explained that problematizing the mainstream connotations of big data, data activism takes a critical stance towards massive data collection and represents the new frontier of citizens' engagement with information and technological innovation. To provide an alternative to the way in which big tech companies or state agencies engage with data, the focus is on mobilizing data sets for social causes. To provide protection from big tech corporations and state aid from what big tech corporations and state agencies do with data, the focus is on developing and encouraging employment of technologies that frustrate massive data collection. Milan and van der Velden add that by postulating a critical or active engagement with data, its forms, dynamics, and infrastructure, data activists function as producers of counter-expertise and alternative epistemologies, making sense of data as a way of knowing the world and turning it into a point of intervention. When formulating the notion of data activist research, then Kazansky et al. Suggest a new approach to knowledge production, combining embeddedness in the social world with the research methods typical of academia and the innovative repertoires of data activists. The core of data activist research is that it is focused on more than doing no harm, more than lessening the moral and social impact of data-driven practices, but actually, in fact, on actively facilitating change for the better in communities in which data-driven practices are applied, which means that data has to be representative of the needs and interests of those it is intended to support. As such, this kind of research is part of the development and deployment of AI technologies, generating ethical values and their regulation from the bottom up, and not an add-on tick box ethics. The second kind of bottom-up approach is virtue ethics. This pertains to being virtuous in this context is viewed as a lifelong journey of striving to be the most virtuous person one can be or one can become. For Aristotle, virtue is not the result of abstract understanding of what is truly good for us. Rather, it is the result of training and a habit based on natural deliberation in each situation. Hagendorf makes clear that the value of such an approach in the context of AI ethics is that it is focused on situation-specific deliberations, on addressing personality traits and behavioral dispositions on the part of technology developers. The technologists or software engineers and their social context are the primary addressees of such an ethics, not technology itself. AI ethics is an adaptive process and cannot be thought of or approached in terms of technological solutions only, or in terms of top-down regulation, since it not only negotiates possible harm from AI systems, but also the underlying systematic challenges faced in society at a given time. Disciplinary, geopolitical, and economic challenges, both as generators of data fueling the AI lifecycle on the one hand, and the result of AI applications on the other hand, are diverse and constantly changing, and so is the very technology at issue. This motivates, then, a comprehensive, participative, adaptive virtue ethics model underpinning AI ethics considerations. Furthermore, the focus in Aristotelian virtue ethics is precisely on how to harness intellectual and moral values together to ensure a virtuous life. Thus, the focus is on techno-moral values such as virtues such as honesty, justice, courage, empathy, care, and civility. This picks up on Morley et al.'s call for a movement from what to how that addresses practice, the good and the just, and also on calls by Crawford and Taylor for AI ethics to focus as much on people than on code. It also addresses the danger of moral de-skilling, heeding the warnings by Shannon Baller. As on this model, every AI actor is actively involved in taking up their own ethical responsibilities and constantly working on bettering their rational decision-making abilities in the moral context. Now, the last bottom-up approach is ethics as service. And this came into being because it became clear that at the moment there is little evidence that the use of any of the translation tools, the how, focusing on the how and not the what of AI ethics, has really had an impact on the governability of algorithmic systems. The reasons for this include the fact that these tools are either too flexible or too strict, that they are vulnerable to manipulation, that they are more diagnostic than prescriptive, so they don't really tell the practitioners what to do, and that they're often viewed as a once-off test. Addressing these concerns implies a need to recognize that ethical consideration must be part of everything that happens in a company and must be an ongoing process. Morley et al. Then suggest an approach to AI ethics as service in response, which is based on Habermas's notion of discourse ethics and Floridi's notion of distributed responsibility. In such an approach to AI ethics, responsibility would be distributed over at least an independent multidisciplinary ethics board and the internal company employees. The board would develop a principle-based ethical code, negotiate it with all stakeholders in a process of open discourse, would decide on processes for evaluating, verifying, and validating algorithmic design, and would conduct regular audits. Internal company employees would then customize the above by defining ethical principles contextually, working with the most appropriate translational tools at the right level of abstraction, and documenting design processes. Morley et al. However, acknowledged that this approach may still not fully address the concern that the impacts of AI systems cannot be entirely controlled through technical design, mostly because of the unexpected, unpredictable, and non-linear ways in which agents and systems interact with each other in complex systems. But it is a step forward in terms of acknowledging that AI ethics is not a static set of rules and that we need a bottom-up approach in AI ethics. So just to confirm, the status of AI systems as complex non-deterministic systems. Anane and Crawford warned that AI ethics must deal with the fact that algorithmic systems are designed, developed, deployed, and used in contexts within which both human and non-human actors operate and have many non-deterministic impacts on each other. In response, AI ethics cannot be practiced as a loose standing or static kind of aim that can be objectively achieved, as not only the technology does not necessarily react in predictable ways, but the social systems underlying it and to which or within which it is applied are also unpredictable and dynamic. Terser suggests that, therefore, AI ethics should be seen as a reflective development process, spanning all actions relating to the full life cycle of systems and including all actors. But there is another foundational concern apart from the complexity of these systems, which is in fact well discussed in recent post-phenomenology in the philosophy of technology, but not yet adequately taken up in AI ethics discourses, that must be considered in rethinking the domain and nature of AI ethics in order to inform more effective regulation. And this pertains to the ability of AI systems to change and manipulate human values in very subtle ways. To address this concern, I will introduce, and this concern underlies all other AI ethics concerns, I will introduce a concept that I call value layering, inherent to machine learning practices, which illustrates that the values and aims of machine learning research are influenced by many factors, including the personal and professional preferences of researchers and reviewers, funding agencies and companies, and larger systemic pressures, including systems of oppression impacting who is able to do research and on which topics. And secondly, I will introduce a notion of AI technologies being value infused, which pertains to the interaction between different kinds of value affected by AI technologies, from technical practical ones such as metrics to technical operational ones such as performance and generalization, to economic and political values through to human moral values. So in terms of value-layered machine learning, in their analysis of the most highly cited papers across two of the most influential current machine learning publication platforms, Bernheim et al. Identified the multi-layered nature, what I call the multi-layered nature of values in machine learning practices. So let us consider just the discussion of the value of performance that is so dear to machine learning practitioners. Bernheim et al. Warned that while it might seem intrinsic for the field to care about performance, it is important to remember that models are not simply well-performing or accurate in the abstract, but always in relation to and as quantified by some metric on some data set. They show that performance values are influenced by various layered values, often with strong links to political considerations. Firstly, they found that performance values are consistently and unquestioningly operationalized as correctness averaged across individual predictions, giving equal weight to each instance. But deciding to use equal weights when averaging is a value-laden move, which might deprioritize those underrepresented in the data or the world, as well as societal and evaluee needs and preferences. Secondly, they found that a common justification for choosing a certain data set is applicability to the real world. But again, they warn that assumptions about how to characterize or represent the real world are value-laden. One such assumption is the availability of large data sets, but they warn that presupposing the availability of large data sets is power centralizing because it encodes favoritism to those with resources to obtain and process them. Other value-laden assumptions include that the real world is binary or discrete, and that data sets come with a predefined ground truth label for each example, presuming that a true label always exists out there, independent of those carving it out, defining and labeling it, which goes against calls from marginalized scholars for machine learning models that allow for non-binaries, plural truths, contextual truths, and many ways of being. Thirdly, the very prioritization of performance values in machine learning practices also requires critical reflection. They write that valuing these properties is so entrenched in the field that generic success terms such as progress or improvement are often used as synonyms for performance and accuracy. And then they make the crucial observation that we can change this, that in fact one might alternatively invoke generic success to mean increasingly safe, consensual, or participatory machine learning that reckons with impacted communities and the environment. The conclusion from studies such as this one is that decisions relating to technical values, such as performance, efficiency, generalization, and others, are always based on assumptions of other technical values and entangled with personal, professional, and systemic political and economic values. Thus, in fact, machine learning practices are propelled by multiple layers of values. And there is more to this. This is the fact that this value-layered nature of machine learning practices creates technologies that effect value change in terms of shaping how people think about future moral and political and economic priorities. In terms of value change, think of the impact of the advancement of AI technologies on the future of work as a concrete illustration of how prioritizing certain technical values have resulted in the prioritizing of not only novel skills that would fit into an entirely new worldview, but also affects the prioritization of certain moral and social values driving that worldview. Another example is the familiar concern about how human interaction with social robots may change how humans value their human-human relations. A more subtle example is offered to us in the natural language processing domain, recently highlighted by Tim Gebru and others. Big data sets driving current NLP practices have an inherent danger of amplifying human bias in various ways, which, if combined with the fact that often as much as whole seemingly coherent but in fact meaningless paragraphs can be generated by large language models, heightens the potential for automation bias, deliberate misuse, and amplification of a hegemonic worldview. Here is ample illustration of how technical values, shaped by and shaping economic and political values, finally may result in shaping how people think about moral values in the real world. And these initial technical values are not focused on the general social good or the well-being of any vulnerable group to start off with. They are professional, business, and finance, and often also politically driven values, and yet are being allowed to shape thinking about the very human ethical values AI ethics regulation is focused on protecting, and that are core to living in harmony with AI technologies. In a sense, it seems, even without having reached singularity, AI systems may already be super ethical in the sense of generating their own values, or at least manipulating human ones, based on a combination of quality of data training sets and the internal mechanics of machine learning. In this scenario, where not only words change depending on who speaks them, but also thinking about values changes depending on how they underpin and are embedded into AI systems, it seems there may be no way towards harmonious living with AI technologies. Or is there? Well, it is clear that AI ethics cannot address this concern, or all these concerns, if interpreted as a static top-down system. But can we mobilize data activist research such that machine learning models are only applied to communities in which data-driven practices are applied if it is to the benefit of the community? Can we reinterpret success as meaning increasingly safe, consensual, or participatory machine learning that reckons with impacted communities and the environment? Can we ensure that there is open discourse among ethics advisory boards, all ethical patients, and all company employees to ensure customized ethical guidelines, and thus also, in fact, supporting virtual ethics practices? Can we ensure that not only design, but also development, deployment, and use of AI systems are aligned with such customized values via translation methodologies that are at the correct level of abstraction for that community? We can do all of the above if we see ethics as our constant ally and companion on the road to harmonious living in the era of AI. I suggest that an active understanding of ethics as a dynamic system of values that simultaneously accompanies and is informed by all AI actors throughout the life cycles of AI systems may in the end be the only way to enable beneficial AI. AI ethics must deal with the fact that people's thinking about ethics changes as human society and technology change. The only way to protect the integrity of shared moral values is to rethink ethics as being outside society and technology to being inside, enabling just societies and innovative technology in a symbiotic co-shaping relationship with humans and technology. Given this very potential for value symbiosis, AI ethics regulation should thus clearly not be focused on prescribing abstract principles, but rather on simultaneously and continuously and critically evaluating bottom-up values, which through a combination of different activities, inclusion of all AI actors and sensitivity to context may result in ensuring the amplification of positive values during processes of value mutualism, typical of machine learning practice. These activities should be driven by data research activism and multidisciplinary social systems analyses and should combine all the approaches discussed here, establishing open AI ethical discourse between all stakeholders and AI actors and encouraging ethical responsibility at the micro level in the tech community. I also suggest incorporating careful pre-mortem reflections that are focused on the specific communities being impacted on, and also post hoc explanatory discussions, trying to add a little bit more than just mathematical explanation by also focusing on social impact. The way toward living in harmony in the era of AI is ultimately by protecting the integrity of human values and the interconnectedness of all humans and of humans and the environment. And this can only be affected via bottom-up regulation generated by the communities being impacted on the one hand, and mother tech community on the other, in an organic, immediate, and uncalculated bond of solidarity. Thank you very much.
네, 인공지능 시대의 동맹으로서의 윤리를 주제로 엠마 루트켄 블롬 교수님의 발표를 들어봤습니다. 교수님께서 뜻깊은 말씀을 정말 많이 해주셨는데요. 다시 한번 감사드립니다. Professor Emma Rootken-Bloom from the University of Pretoria in the Republic of South Africa gave us an insightful presentation titled Ethics as Ally in the Age of AI. Well, thank you very much, Professor Bloom, once again for your in-depth presentation. 네, 그럼 다음으로 유럽의 인공지능 규제를 주제로 두 번째 세션을 시작하도록 하겠습니다. Now let us begin session 2 titled AI Regulations in Europe. 두 번째 세션의 첫 번째 발표는 새로운 EU 입법 패키지가 인공지능에 미치는 영향을 주제로 독일 튜빙겐 대학교 미셸 플링크 교수님께서 진행해 주시겠습니다. And the first presentation of session 2 titled The New EU Legislative Package and Its Impact on Artificial Intelligence will be delivered by Professor Michel Flink from the University of Tübingen in Germany. So without further ado, let us virtually meet Professor Michel Flink online. So Professor Flink, please take it away. 그럼 미셸 플링크 교수님의 첫 번째 발표죠. 세션 2의 첫 번째 발표 지금부터 들어보겠습니다. 여러분 함께 보시죠.
So hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to join you today to talk about the European Union's new legislative agenda on artificial intelligence. Tell from its name, this is a piece of proposed legislation that is specifically designed to address artificial intelligence. So I'll be giving an overview of what the AI Act tries to do, where it comes from, what its main objectives and components are. And then I'll be closing by providing some food for thought for our subsequent discussion. Right, so this is our current, policy climate in the European Union. So the von der Leyen Commission took office in 2019, and it set up 5 different policy priorities for its 5-year period. And as you can see, the second of the European Commission's current political priorities is to make Europe fit for the digital age. And this digital agenda is very broad, but essentially the European digital strategy is made up of various components. It's definitely a political agenda with a number of associated policies. It's also a strategy that makes funding available for various kinds of research or development around artificial intelligence. So the European Commission has, over the past years and months, suggested a series of different new pieces of secondary legislation. Rather, the proposed pieces of legislation would complement an already existing framework of EU secondary legislation that already applies to various kinds and various applications of artificial intelligence, such as, for instance, the General Data Protection Regulation, which, of course, applies where personal data is being used in AI, and others include the Regulation on the Free Flow of Personal Data, the EU Cybersecurity Act, and the Open Data Directive. And in addition to this, of course, there's also various rules in different member states that either apply to AI directly or just sort of general legal rules such as contract law, tort law, which of course are also applicable in relation to AI. So that's sort of the existing setting that we currently have in the EU. And what the European Commission is currently pursuing very ambitiously is to complement the existing EU legal framework applicable to AI and the data that is being used to do AI by a number of new legislative initiatives. The first one is the Draft Artificial Intelligence Act. I'll say more about that in a second. So I'm not going to go into detail here, but the Draft AI Act is also accompanied by 4 additional legislative proposals that would also impact AI. And I think this is important to note to the extent that it's not just the AI Act that will change the regulatory landscape for artificial intelligence, but also all of those additional schemes. So let me say a few sentences about each of them. So the first one would be the Draft Digital Services Act. Again, this is just a draft. It has been suggested by the Commission. It's now being negotiated in the context of the EU's ordinary legislative procedure. So we don't exactly know what its sort of final shape will be. But at present, the Draft Digital Services Act contains provisions on research data access, which of course is data that can be developed that can be used as training data in artificial intelligence. And it also has provisions on recommender algorithms, specifically transparency obligations that arise in some circumstances. The second proposal is the Draft Digital Markets Act, which contains provisions on software distribution, operating systems, and hardware as they can be used in the development and use of artificial intelligence. Then we also have the Draft Data Governance Act. As its name reveals, this is specifically about data And we, of course, all know that data is a crucial ingredient in artificial intelligence. And the Data Governance Act essentially creates a legal framework for various kinds of data sharing arrangements that are also meant to stimulate the availability of data for artificial intelligence. And then, Data Act is expected to propose provisions that would facilitate access to and usage of data, including in business to business and business to government relationships. The expected Data Act is also expected to review the rules on the legal protection of databases that already exist in European Union law at this stage. So really what you can see from this overview is that there's a very vivid regulatory and legislative discussion around artificial intelligence going on in the EU right now. The European Commission has suggested a number of different draft pieces of legislation that are designed to create a framework for the creation of trustworthy artificial intelligence in the EU. So that are really meant to provide legal certainty for those developing and using AI, and to steer AI in a direction that's considered normatively desirable. And as its name reveals, the draft artificial intelligence is a key piece of this emerging legal puzzle on AI. So again, I'm going to emphasize that the draft Artificial Intelligence Act is a draft act. That means that it's currently just a proposal. It will undergo significant negotiations in the years to come. It will probably take a few years until it is finalized. And as a consequence thereof, its provisions, as they currently stand, will likely be subject to some modification. So what I'm going to say captures the current form of the legislative proposal, but of course the final version might diverge depending on what the outcome of the ongoing negotiations will be. So let me now turn to talk about the draft Artificial Intelligence Act. So as all other pieces of proposed legislation that I was talking about, this is a draft act, and this means that it has been put forward by the European Commission, but will now be negotiated over the next couple of years. And as a result thereof, we can also expect that the final form of the AI Act will diverge to some degree from its current form. So I think to understand the context of where the AI Act is coming from, it's important to point out that it is based on Article 114 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. And this essentially means that it is intended to be a market harmonization instrument. So essentially, the AI Act is designed to create rules that apply in the same way across the different member states of the European Union, and that are thus able to facilitate trade within the internal market. And of course, one of the first things that you might be wondering about in relation to the AI Act is what the definition of AI that is being employed by this act actually is. And the draft act currently defines AI, or rather an AI system. So the act refers to AI systems as opposed to sort of AI as such, as software that generates an output based on a set of human-defined objectives that are developed with a specific data or code-driven technique. And again, this is a definition that might change. One of the points that have, for instance, been criticized by some commentators is that the reference to a set of human-defined objectives might be undesirable to the extent that we could have an AI system that pursues a set of AI-defined objectives as opposed to human-defined objectives, and that with this definition would fall outside the scope of the Artificial Intelligence Act. So the definition itself is something that's currently being discussed, and that might change over the years to come. So let me now turn to the sort of like general structure and the general idea of what the AI does. So the general spirit of the AI Act is to regulate different AI systems in accordance with their perceived risk level. So the AI Act creates different categories of AI on the basis of the risks that they are perceived to create. And there's essentially 4 different categories that we can find in the AI Act. The first is that of prohibited AI practices. So those are practices that are considered to be so risky that they are subject to an outright or a qualified prohibition. The second are those of high-risk AI systems. So those are AI systems considered to create a high risk that's not high enough for them to be prohibited, but still high enough for them to be subject to a range of legal requirements. And then there's the AI Act also refers to certain AI systems. The terminology, is, I think, a little bit confusing, but it essentially refers to certain kinds of AI use cases that have a limited risk and that as a result thereof must abide by some transparency rules. And then there's also a residual category of non-high risk AI systems that are not subject to any legal obligations, but sort of encouraged to abide by some rules. Now, I'm going to introduce all of those different categories in just a second by talking about what they are and what specific legal obligations are that they would be subject to. But for the general understanding of what the Draft AI Act does, I think there's also 2 additional points that are still worth noting to better understand where this legal structure that we're currently debating in the European Union comes from. So the first one is that the structure of the AI Act is actually based on existing EU product safety legislation. Existing rules that we have in relation to products such as children's toys, for instance, lifts, aircraft machinery, etc. And this is an approach that, of course, has advantages and disadvantages. The advantages are that the EU is not sort of reinventing the wheel and able to benefit from the ample experience that has been gained in those sectors. But it also comes to some disadvantages to the extent that we can see that in relation to specific points, this adherence to EU product safety legislation has led to the formulation of rules that maybe are not very suitable to the very nature of artificial intelligence. And then the final point is that the Draft AI Act would not be applicable to military applications. So this is a sort of general exception that we're seeing in most of the AI-specific legal or regulatory regimes that are being developed across the world. Right, so let me now turn to the 4 different categories of artificial intelligence as devised by the Draft Artificial Intelligence Act, explain what they are, and explain what the different legal requirements that arise in relation to them are. So the first category is that of prohibited AI practices. And essentially, those are some AI systems that are considered so risky that they are subject to either outright or qualified prohibitions under the Artificial Intelligence Act. And this is an approach that was discussed since the very early days of the AI Act. It's an approach that was discussed by the high-level expert committee on AI that the European Commission put together a few years ago. And it turned out that this was one of the most controversial topics. So there has been a long-standing discussion in the EU as to whether, for instance, all forms of facial recognition should be banned, as we're seeing happening in some other jurisdictions. And there were also early leaks of the AI Act that went further in this direction than the current proposal does. And so given the controversial nature of those prohibited practices, this, of course, is also an area that might be changed as negotiations around the AI Act go on. Right, so that said, let me introduce you to the prohibited AI practices that are currently contained in the Draft AI Act. So first of all, the AI Act would prohibit manipulative systems that either deploy subliminal techniques beyond a person's consciousness in order to materially distort a person's behavior in a way that causes or is likely to cause physical or psychological harm. Now, this is a somewhat, I guess, funky formulation of the kinds of AI systems that would be prohibited. It's not entirely clear what exactly this would cover. The European Commission gave some examples. I think one of the examples that it gave was an AI-powered sound system in a van that would make a driver drive for longer than would be safe for them to do. But beyond this, I guess, somewhat futuristic example, there's a lot of uncertainty right now as to what is covered by this, right? We might, for instance, wonder whether some recommendation algorithms that are being used in some contexts could be caught by this as well, even though they are much more mundane examples than the examples that the European Commission gave. So I think that this is an area where we'll see lots of discussion about in the years to come. And then the second manipulative system that is prohibited are systems that exploit vulnerabilities of a specific group of persons due to their age, physical or mental disability, again, in a way that causes or is likely to cause physical or psychological harm. And this reference to physical or psychological harm is something that has been criticized because it is a requirement of individual harm. However, one of the most, I guess, feared elements of artificial intelligence or implications thereof is that it's not just able to induce individual harm, but also societal harm, right? So we, for instance, seen this in relation to effects that it may come to have on democracy. And this collective dimension of the implications of a given AI system is something that's currently not being acknowledged by the AI Act here. And then there's two other AI practices that are subject to an outright or qualified prohibition by the AI Act. The second is the use of social scoring by public authorities, where the score leads to detrimental treatment of persons or groups that are unrelated to the context where data was originally generated or collected, or detrimental or unfavorable treatment of persons or groups that is unjustified or disproportionate to their social behavior or its gravity. Now, what you'll notice from this provision is the reference to public authorities. That means that private authorities using social scoring will not fall within the scope of this prohibition. And there's uncertainty as to where the lines between public and private can be drawn here, right? So what about, for instance, public-private partnerships that make use of AI systems in order to create a social scoring system? Would they be caught by this prohibition or not? That's one of the questions that still stand in relation to this. And then the third prohibited AI practice, which is a qualified prohibition, is the use of real-time remote biometric identification systems in publicly accessible spaces for the purposes of law enforcement. So in general, law enforcement cannot rely on real-time remote biometric identification systems, so essentially facial recognition systems. But there's exceptions to this. So they can be used in such circumstances where this is done for the targeted search of victims of crime, including children, for the prevention of a specific imminent threat to the life or physical safety of natural persons or of a terrorist attack, and for the detection and localization or prosecution of a perpetrator or suspect of a particularly severe offense. Now, as you can imagine, given the nature of this provision, this is one of the things that are currently being discussed. Two of the criticisms that have been voiced is that it only relates to real-time biometric identification systems and not to ex post remote biometric identification systems. So, for instance, this provision would not catch a police authority that uses facial recognition to a few weeks after the event identify participants in a lawful protest, for instance. It's also worth noting that this only refers to publicly accessible spaces, which sort of in the real world means that it doesn't apply to private spaces, but it also wouldn't apply to online spaces. And I think that's also an interesting omission, particularly nowadays where everyone's about the thing that in to such senses. All right, so let me now move on to talk about high-risk AI systems. So the AI creates various categories of high-risk AI systems. First of all, those are systems that are products or safety components of products that are already covered by EU health and safety harmonizing legislation. And then secondly, those are also AI systems that apply in the following areas. So remote and post-biometric identification systems, management and operation of critical infrastructure, educational and vocational training, employment, worker management, and access to self-employment, access and enjoyment to essential services and benefits, law enforcement, migration, asylum, and border control, and the administration of justice and democracy. Now, one thing that's worth noting about this sort of selective list of different applications is that the European Commission would be competent to amend this list with time. So those are the categories of high-risk AI systems created by the AI Act. Now, what are the obligations that apply to high-risk AI systems? Well, essentially, there needs to be a high-risk management system, which needs to take the form of a continuous iterative process that is run throughout the entire life cycle of high-risk artificial intelligence systems, and which identifies, estimates, and evaluates risks and provides suitable risk management measures. Where high-risk AI systems are being deployed, specific data governance mechanisms also need to be respected, which are designed to ensure that the training, validation, and testing data are relevant, representative, free of errors, and complete. Now, one of the things that's worth noting about this is that the reference to free of errors and complete is, of course, laudable, but maybe overambitious from a practical perspective. Since having, if you're having a large data set, a requirement of it to be 100% free of errors is hard to implement in practice. And the notion of complete is, of course, one that's subject to uncertainty, since there's no legal definition as to what complete is. There's also technical documentation and record keeping rules that need to be respected. The AI Act also provides for specific transparency rules and rules regarding the provision of information to users in relation to high-risk systems. And then there's also requirements in relation to human oversight and accuracy, robustness, and cybersecurity of those systems. Now, the third category of AI systems that is being created by the AI Act is that of certain AI systems. And essentially, this is a sort of residual list of a few use cases of artificial intelligence that would be subject to specific transparency obligations under Article 52 of the Act. And this includes so-called right to know. It provides that users have a right to know when they're interacting with an AI system. This is also sometimes referred to as a bot disclosure rules. It also foresees that users of emotion recognition systems and biometric categorization systems must be informed where they are exposed thereto. This again is something that has been criticized to the extent that when we're talking about something so sensitive as emotion recognition systems, probably it's not just that we want transparency in relation to, but there's also legitimate reasons as to why you might want to have rules regarding the deployment of those systems, given the sort of intimate sphere that they're relating to, and also given that there's oftentimes lots of errors in those systems with potentially far-reaching consequences they're being applied. And then those transparency rules also apply to deepfake content, which must be disclosed as such. Now, let me say a few words about the remaining category of non-high-risk AI systems. So essentially, those are all other use cases of artificial intelligence. They are not subject to any specific legal obligations under the AI Act, but the AI Act nonetheless provides that there could be codes of conduct which aim to encourage providers of non-high-risk AI systems to voluntarily adopt the mandatory requirements for high-risk AI systems. The AI Act also refers to the possibility for providers of non-high-risk AI systems to create and implement those systems themselves. And those codes of conduct, they are encouraged to also take into account issues that are not given any normative force by the AI Act, such as issues around ability. And this, of course, is something that has been criticized to the extent that no foreseen binding legal rules in relation to sustainability in the current format of the AI Act. And this issue has rather been sort of, put to at the very back of the priority, to the extent that it's merely something that codes of conduct, which are voluntary anyways, may want to include. And this is, I guess, a particular paradox if you think about the fact that the European Commission policy priorities that I mentioned at the beginning, the digital agenda is one of them, but the sustainability and climate agenda are another. And at present, we don't really have any bridges between those two policy priorities. And certainly this is also in the form of the AI Act. Now, after view of the different categories of artificial intelligence that would be covered by the AI Act and the different legal rules that would apply to each categories, let me just close with sort of observations. The first one is the importance of standards and standardization bodies going forward. Now, from the overview that I provided, this is probably something that is not really obvious. But if you look at this in the broader scheme of things and the broader scheme of how regulation works in the European Union, it's quite clear that standards will be essential to the extent that providers of AI systems will have the opportunity to either themselves interpret and implement the various of the Artificial Intelligence Act, or abide by standards that have been developed by standardization bodies on the basis of those cases will be cheaper and also safer for providers of AI systems. And of course, that again is something like everything that has advantages and disadvantages, but the disadvantages related to standardization, as they're increasingly being discussed in the EU, is definitely something that's also worth bearing in mind when we think the practical implications that the AI Act will have in the years to come. The second point to note is that the AI Act very clearly has against the adoption of a rights-based approach. Some people have advocated for that and have argued that an artificial intelligence should include the rights, just for instance, to be subject to a prohibited AI practice or a right to file or to collective redress through NGO, and those rights have been included in the AI Act. It's not a rights approach with all the advantages and disadvantages that entails. The third point that I think is really important to know is that following EU product law has, again, advantages, but it also explains that some provisions seem unsuitable in light of the very nature of AI. So I refer to the requirement on the regarding individual harm in relation to prohibited practices. Yet this is something that stands at odds with the sort of like collective classification nature of AI systems. And this is the AI Act, as also all the other pieces of legislation, so the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Services Act, the Digital Evidence Act, and probably also the Data Act. that are currently being discussed is that there's an overall tension between the existing general data regulation and those different provisions. To the extent that the newer pieces of legislation are more designed to be enabling frameworks that facilitate the usage of AI and the usage of data, and that in many contexts clash with existing data protection rules. This is something that the European Data Protection Board has, for instance, referred to. And this is not yet being openly acknowledged. So this will likely be something that will create challenges at the implementation stage. And some people are also criticize the AI Act as well as the other pieces of legislation that form part of the broader EU digital strategy. The EU has essentially prioritized the creation of new norms applicable to AI and data, rather than making sure that the existing norms are being respected. So there's currently a debate going on in the EU that relates to the fact that the GDPR, for instance, is being insufficiently enforced to a range of different reasons. And some people have contended that it would have been desirable for the European Commission to rather focus on the enforcement of existing rules rather than sort of add to existing rules that might ultimately not be enforced. All right, so I'm going to stop here and look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
네. 튜빙겐 대학교 미셸 핑크 교수님께서 새로운 EU 입법 패키지가 인공지능에 미치는 영향 주제로 아주 심도 있는 발표를 해주셨습니다. 미셸 핑크 교수님 감사합니다. Michelle Fink from the University of Tübingen in Germany has just delivered a very detailed presentation titled The New EU Legislative Package and Its Impact on Artificial Intelligence. Well, thank you very much, Professor Michelle Fink. Once again, we sincerely appreciate it. 네, 다음으로 프랑스 파리 낭테르 대학교 루시 클루젤 메테이에 교수님의 발표를 들어보도록 하겠습니다. 두 번째 발표의 주제는 프랑스 공공부문에서의 인공지능 규제입니다. Next, the second presentation of session 2, titled Regulation of AI in the French Public Sector, will be delivered by Professor Lucie Cluzel-Métayer from the University of Paris-Nanterre in France. So without further ado, let us virtually meet Professor Métayer online. So Professor Métayer, the floor is yours. 세션 2의 두 번째 발표 역시 영상으로 만나보도록 하겠습니다. 여러분 함께 보시죠.
Je tiens d'abord à remercier les organisateurs de ce colloque pour m'avoir invité à intervenir. Ce sujet porte sur la régulation de l'intelligence artificielle dans le secteur public en France. Ce sujet est particulièrement intéressant pour la juriste que je suis car il est en pleine reconfiguration. Je vais donc parler des algorithmes publics, c'est-à-dire des algorithmes qui sont utilisés par les acteurs publics pour prendre des décisions. Car ce fait-là est assez consensuel. Le fait est que les administrations, un peu partout dans le monde, utilisent de plus en plus des algorithmes pour prendre des décisions. Alors, dans cette introduction, je voudrais rapidement montrer l'ampleur du phénomène, mais aussi expliquer la particularité de ces algorithmes dits publics pour bien mettre en évidence l'importance d'en réguler l'utilisation. Et je vais d'abord voir dans cette introduction l'essor des algorithmes publics. Je ne vais pas dresser un panorama bien évidemment exhaustif des algorithmes qui sont utilisés par les administrations. Mais on peut, en s'appuyant sur un rapport intéressant sur l'État-providence digitale qu'a rédigé Philippe Alsan, qui est rapporteur spécial pour les Nations Unies sur l'extrême pauvreté et les droits humains, qu'il a rédigé en 2019, on peut retenir une approche fonctionnaliste qui permet de donner quelques exemples à travers donc une cartographie assez claire. On peut classer les algorithmes publics à partir de 5 fonctions. Il y a des algorithmes qui permettent de vérifier l'identité des citoyens. En France, sur ce terrain, on est un petit peu en retard si on regarde ce qu'on fait par exemple au Singapour, mais on a mis en place une application qui permet un accès dématérialisé aux services publics par le biais de la reconnaissance faciale, qui est l'application Alicem. Il y a des algorithmes, deuxième catégorie, qui conditionnent l'accès aux services publics, qui conditionnent l'accès aux droits et aux services publics. et ces algorithmes prolifèrent. Ce sont des algorithmes qui permettent l'attribution d'aides sociales, par exemple, ou encore qui permettent d'affecter les étudiants dans les établissements d'enseignement supérieur en France. Il y a eu un algorithme assez célèbre qui s'appelle Parcoursup, qui est toujours d'actualité, qui permet donc d'affecter les étudiants dans l'enseignement supérieur dans les universités. Troisième catégorie d'algorithmes, ceux qui permettent d'identifier les fraudes. Ceux-là aussi sont assez répandus. Les fraudes sociales, les fraudes fiscales sont traquées par le biais d'algorithmes. Et d'ailleurs, des algorithmes assez intéressants, ce sont des algorithmes auto-apprenants, dits de machine learning, qui apprennent de manière autonome, qui s'améliorent de manière autonome en fonction des données qui les alimentent. En France, il y a donc un algorithme qui est utilisé par l'administration fiscale, qui s'appelle ciblage de la fraude et valorisation des requêtes, et qui permet, depuis 2020, de fouiller les réseaux sociaux pour mieux identifier, pour mieux cibler les fraudeurs. On trouve le même type d'algorithme dans la lutte contre la fraude sociale. Quatrième catégorie, les algorithmes qui permettent d'identifier les risques sanitaires, bien sûr, qui a justifié la mise en place d'applications de traçage, mais aussi des algorithmes dits sécuritaires, qui visent à traquer les risques sécuritaires, et on parle bien sûr de l'essor de la police prédictive à ce sujet. Cinquième catégorie, enfin, ce sont les algorithmes qui permettent de communiquer avec les administrés. En France, il y a un programme qui s'appelle le Plan Action publique 2022, qui vise à dématérialiser l'ensemble des démarches administratives et qui consacre donc cette logique de remplacer l'humain par la machine, par la technique. Nous expérimentons tout cela à l'heure actuelle. Qu'est-ce que ces algorithmes ont de particulier? Eh bien, ils sont publics, ils sont utilisés par des autorités administratives pour prendre des décisions publiques. Ce peut être pour prendre des décisions individuelles qui visent une personne en particulier. C'est le cas, par exemple, de l'algorithme que j'ai cité tout à l'heure, Parcoursup, ou encore l'algorithme fiscal qui vise à traquer les fraudeurs. Ce peut être aussi des algorithmes qui sont utilisés pour prendre des actes réglementaires, des arrêtés, des décrets, et qui peuvent avoir des effets collectifs non négligeables. À ce titre, par exemple, en France, on a autorisé par décret un algorithme pour détecter le port du masque dans les transports publics. Et ça ne vise pas à prendre des décisions individuelles, mais à prendre des mesures plus générales. Ces décisions ont ceci de particulier qu'elles ont un caractère directement exécutoire, c'est-à-dire qu'elles modifient dès leur entrée en vigueur l'ordre juridique en conférant des droits aux particuliers, en leur refusant des droits ou en mettant à leur charge des obligations. Et elles peuvent également, notamment quand ce sont des mesures de police administrative, être particulièrement attentatoires aux libertés fondamentales. Elles peuvent effectivement porter atteinte à la vie privée ou encore à la liberté d'expression, bien sûr. Et c'est précisément en raison de ces spécificités que l'utilisation des algorithmes publics doit faire l'objet d'une réglementation particulière. Alors, dans un article que j'ai trouvé très intéressant de 2019, qui a été publié dans Nature Machine Intelligence, The Global Landscape of AI Ethics Guidelines, des chercheurs ont dressé un panorama de la littérature sur les enjeux éthiques de l'utilisation de l'intelligence artificielle. Et ils constatent une certaine convergence autour de certains principes. La transparence, qui comprend la communication, l'ouverture, l'explicabilité et la compréhension. La justice et l'équité, qui comprend la non-discrimination, la réversibilité, le droit au recours, c'est ce qu'on appelle le fairness. La non-malfaisance, on peut traduire comme ça, qui correspond au principe selon lequel la machine ne doit pas porter atteinte, bien sûr, à la sécurité et à l'intégrité des personnes. La responsabilité. La responsabilité, c'est la maîtrise de l'algorithme et l'attribution des responsabilités qui sont impliquées par son Et enfin, le respect de la vie privée. Des règles éthiques, oui, des règles éthiques qui, parfois, ont été précisées dans certains documents de droit souple, des recommandations, des guidelines, des avis qui se sont multipliés, produits parfois par des autorités de régulation, parfois par les acteurs même du secteur, mais aussi dans le cadre de ce qu'on appelle le droit dur, c'est-à-dire par des normes contraignantes. En effet, dans plusieurs des États, dont la France, le droit positif est venu consacrer certaines de ces exigences à partir des années 2015-2016 à peu près. Et d'ailleurs, le prochain règlement européen sur l'intelligence artificielle entend précisément consacrer certaines de ces exigences. Le cadre juridique est donc en train de se mettre en place. La question est de savoir si ce cadre sera suffisant pour réguler efficacement l'intelligence artificielle utilisée par les autorités publiques. Tenter de répondre à cette question suppose, à mon sens, de s'interroger d'une part sur les enjeux de la régulation de l'IA. Pourquoi réguler? Ce sera la première partie de mon intervention. D'autre part, sur la construction de la régulation de l'intelligence artificielle. Et je répondrai, j'essaierai en tout cas de répondre à la question de savoir comment. D'abord, donc, première question, pourquoi réguler? La régulation a de multiples vertus. On peut identifier plusieurs types d'enjeux. Il y a des enjeux démocratiques, des enjeux juridiques et des enjeux économiques. Je commence par les enjeux démocratiques. Réguler l'utilisation de l'algorithme, en particulier communiquer sur les algorithmes, être capable d'expliquer leur rôle dans la prise de la décision publique, capable d'expliquer leur fonctionnement, doit permettre aux citoyens de mieux comprendre la décision, de mieux l'accepter et partant anticiper. Donc, c'est un gage de confiance et c'est un gage de sécurité juridique pour tous les acteurs. Il y a des enjeux juridiques, bien sûr. Les enjeux sont juridiques, à ce titre, la transparence, l'accès à l'algorithme et la condition sine qua non pour pouvoir vérifier que les pouvoirs publics respectent bien la légalité. La transparence, finalement, c'est une condition de l'état de comment, en effet, savoir si le fonctionnement de l'algorithme ne comporte aucun biais, notamment discriminatoire, si l'on n'y a pas effectivement la condition sine qua non de pouvoir contrôler. Deuxième enjeu important au niveau juridique, c'est le droit au recours contre l'utilisation de l'algorithme. Recours en annulation contre un acte qui serait basé sur un algorithme ou le recours en responsabilité lorsqu'un préjudice a par exemple été causé par l'utilisation de l'algorithme. Troisième enjeu juridique, je crois, c'est le contrôle de l'algorithme. Comment s'assurer du contrôle par l'algorithme, par la décision qui a été prise sur le fondement d'un algorithme de l'état de droit. Ces algorithmes peuvent être porteurs de biais discriminatoires, tantôt parce que les données qui les alimentent sont elles-mêmes biaisées, empreintes de préjugés, tantôt parce que la conception même de l'algorithme peut générer des biais. Il y a enfin, et cela n'est pas négligeable, il y a enfin des enjeux économiques, et c'est tout à fait fondamental. Imposer des règles à l'utilisation de l'intelligence artificielle, c'est sécuriser juridiquement l'activité pour promouvoir l'innovation, pour promouvoir la recherche et bien sûr le développement économique. À ce sujet, je voudrais dire un mot de la troisième voie, qu'on appelle la troisième voie de l'Union européenne, entre la voie des États-Unis et la voie chinoise. Il y a la voie de l'Union européenne. Elle fait la promotion, d'une part, de la circulation des données pour promouvoir vraiment l'intelligence artificielle en Europe. C'est une question de souveraineté d'ailleurs. C'est notamment l'objet du Data Governance Act du 25 novembre 2020. mission européenne, en effet, est faire de l'Europe un lieu d'innovation et de croissance, créant une économie de la donnée fondée sur la libre circulation et la libre réutilisation des données. C'est ce qu'on appelle l'open data et le big data. Et la Commission tente de mettre en place un cadre commun et alternatif aux solutions proposées par les États-Unis et la Chine. L'objectif, c'est donc d'encourager la circulation des données entre entreprises, mais aussi entre entreprises et administrations publiques. Et le respect des droits fondamentaux dans tout ça, c'est l'objet du règlement général de la protection des données, bien sûr, le fameux RGPD 2016. Très difficile de concilier ces deux logiques, d'open data, de libération débridée des données, et de l'autre, des données personnelles, qui est l'objet du RGPD. Comment réguler efficacement l'intelligence artificielle publique? Comment réguler le choix a été fait en France et en Europe de commencer à réguler les données. Et puis, le droit commence, de manière un peu balbutiante, à intéresser les algorithmes publics. D'abord, donc, voyons comment le droit appréhende les données. La régulation a d'abord porté sur les données personnelles et puis sur les données publiques. En Europe, le droit à la protection des données personnelles a été érigé en droit fondamental par le Conseil de l'Europe d'abord et puis par le droit de l'Union européenne également. Le droit de l'Union européenne également est extrêmement poussé à cet égard. C'est l'article 8 de la Charte des droits fondamentaux de l'Union européenne adoptée en 2000, qui pose le principe d'un droit autonome à la protection des données personnelles. C'est l'article 16, paragraphe 1 du traité sur le fonctionnement de l'Union européenne, qui est la base en réalité du règlement général de la protection des données adopté en 2016, ainsi que de la directive police-justice qui a été adoptée également en 2016 et qui est le droit positif réellement appliqué dans toute l'Europe à l'heure actuelle sur la protection des données personnelles. La CJUE est très active, il faut le dire, la Cour de justice de l'Union européenne est extrêmement active sur la question. J'ai cité quelques exemples emblématiques de son activisme sur ce point, l'arrêt de 2014 Digital Rights Ireland, mais aussi l'arrêt de 2015 Schrems 1 qui invalide la décision d'adéquation entre la France et les États-Unis, le Safe Harbor, la décision d'adéquation du régime américain avec le régime de protection des données européen, et puis l'arrêt Schrems 2 en 2020, qui fait la même chose avec la nouvelle décision d'adéquation qui était le Privacy Shield. L'arrêt aussi de 2016, Télé 2, sur les données de connexion, approfondi par l'arrêt French Data Network. Tout cela est un droit très poussé sur la protection, construit un droit très poussé de la protection des données personnelles. Le droit européen est donc un droit fondamental à la protection des données personnelles. En France, c'est un droit qui est assez ancien, puisque ce droit est inscrit dans la loi Informatique et Liberté du 6 janvier 1978. C'est le texte fondateur, et bien qu'il ait été largement amendé en 1995, en 2004, en 2016 et finalement en 2008 pour prendre acte du règlement européen sur la protection des données. C'est toujours notre texte de référence, avec le droit européen bien sûr, l'applicabilité directe chez nous. Il a pour origine ce texte de 78, une peur du fichage généralisé de la population française des autorités publiques. Donc, c'était la crainte que les autorités publiques fassent un fichage généralisé de toute la population. Évidemment, maintenant, cette cette crainte est dépassée. On ne s'inquiète plus de ce genre de choses puisqu'elle est intégrée en réalité. Et ce texte a pour origine, est à l'origine de la création de notre Commission nationale informatique et liberté, qui est l'autorité de régulation en France sur la protection des données. Ce droit, disons-le tout de suite, en France n'est pas autonome, il est lié au respect de la vie privée. Il n'est pas consacré par la Constitution. Les autorités françaises ont considéré que le droit européen était suffisant, tout comme la jurisprudence du Conseil constitutionnel qui est suffisante aux yeux des autorités françaises pour assurer l'effectivité de ce droit. Le droit qui relève du RGPD opère ce qu'on appelle un changement de paradigme avec un empowerment des citoyens, des personnes, et un système d'accountability des responsables de traitement. Un système d'empowerment, c'est l'affirmation des droits des personnes. Mais leur effectivité dépend avant tout des opérateurs, c'est-à-dire des responsables de traitement. C'est le fait que le droit de la protection des données personnelles est désormais construit sur une logique de responsabilisation des opérateurs comme garantie des droits des personnes. Donc, la protection des données personnelles n'est plus définie préalablement et abstraitement par le législateur, elle est définie concrètement de manière continue par les opérateurs chargés d'évaluer les risques d'atteinte aux droits fondamentaux des personnes et de mettre en œuvre des traitements respectueux de ces droits. Et un rôle de sanction a posteriori plus important qui peut aller donc jusqu'à 20 millions d'euros et 4% du chiffre d'affaires mondial des responsables de traitement. Il y a donc un autre mouvement, un autre droit qui se construit en parallèle de ce droit à la protection des données personnelles, c'est le droit de l'open data, c'est-à-dire au contraire la libération des données. Il y a un mouvement de protection et un mouvement de libération. La régulation donc, de ce droit est le fait d'abord de l'Union européenne. Plusieurs directives, j'ai retenu 3 actes importants dans ce schéma. Une directive de 2003, la directive PSI pour Public Sector Information de 2019 et le Data Governance Act du 25 novembre 2020. Le but de ces directives, c'est de faciliter le partage et la réutilisation des données publiques, mais aussi des données personnelles sous certaines conditions, bien sûr. C'est aussi d'encourager les acteurs privés à partager leurs données avec les autres acteurs publics et privés. C'est ce qu'on peut appeler l'altruisme en matière de données. La France n'est pas mauvais élève parce que le cadre juridique était propice à l'épanouissement de cette transparence. C'est l'article 15, pour mémoire, de la Déclaration des droits de l'homme et du citoyen, selon lequel la société a le droit de demander compte à tout agent public de son administration. C'est un article très ancien, puisque notre Déclaration des droits date de 1789. C'est plutôt une loi de 78 sur laquelle on s'appuie encore, qui est une loi qui rend accessibles les documents administratifs aux administrés. Surtout, l'open data se met en place en France pour transposer la directive de 2003. Ça se met en place en 2005, mais il faut reconnaître qu'elle n'est pas beaucoup appliquée et c'est progressivement via un open data sectoriel, c'est-à-dire sur l'énergie, sur le transport, sur les marchés publics, que se met en place l'open data par une première par loi emblématique, la loi pour une république numérique. 7 octobre 2016. Alors, cette loi pour une république numérique provoque quand même un bouleversement. Open data à tous les services publics, les services administratifs, les services publics industriels et commerciaux également, et qu'elle met en place un principe d'open data par défaut, c'est-à-dire que toutes les informations publiques contenues dans un document communicable doivent être nécessairement libérées. Alors, venons-en maintenant à la question de la régulation de l'IA elle-même. Comment l'usage des algorithmes par les administrations est-il encadré en dehors de ce qui relève des données? Pour l'instant, les usages sont peu encadrés. on va voir les quelques règles qui apparaissent dans l'ordre national, donc en France et en Europe. Pour l'essentiel, elles portent sur deux grandes exigences. Elles portent sur une exigence de communication de l'algorithme public et sur une exigence d'explicabilité. D'abord, une exigence de communication de l'algorithme. C'est la loi pour une république numérique qui, donc, en 2016, impose que les codes sources et les algorithmes publics soient considérés comme des documents communicables. C'est donc l'exigence de transparence qui est actée par cette loi de 2016. Cela signifie d'abord que l'algorithme public doit être communiqué à toute personne qui en fait la demande. C'est inscrit maintenant dans notre code des relations entre le public et l'administration. Et le Conseil constitutionnel, en 2020, en a même fait un droit, un principe fondamental reconnu par les lois de la République, qui signifie que c'est un principe constitutionnel. En outre, cela signifie que les administrés doivent publier en ligne toutes les règles qui définissent les principaux algorithmes qui fondent des décisions individuelles. Une exigence de communication doublée d'une exigence d'explicabilité. On peut la rattacher à une obligation de motivation. Une obligation de motivation des décisions administratives qui a été posée très tôt en 1979. Le législateur a en effet imposé aux responsables de traitement de maîtriser l'algorithme et ses évolutions afin, je cite le législateur, de pouvoir expliquer en détail et sous une forme intelligible à la personne concernée la manière dont le traitement a été mis en place à son égard. C'est la loi du 20 juin 2018 qui pose cette exigence. Et le Conseil constitutionnel a veillé à ce que le législateur interdise l'adoption de décisions administratives individuelles qui seraient exclusivement fondées sur des algorithmes auto-apprenants précisément parce qu'on n'est pas capable d'expliquer ce qu'ils font exactement. On n'est pas capable d'expliquer leur mode de fonctionnement. Donc, la décision, finalement, ne peut être entièrement automatisée que si l'administration peut expliquer le fonctionnement de l'algorithme dont elle résulte. Pas en France, pas pour le moment. Mais le juge a eu l'occasion de s'intéresser à cette question de l'explicabilité. Il y a deux jurisprudences des Pays-Bas qui me semblent intéressantes à relever ici. Une jurisprudence du Conseil d'État des Pays-Bas de 2017 à propos d'un algorithme Aerius qui a été utilisé pour délivrer des autorisations d'occupation des sols, et puis une autre jurisprudence du tribunal de district de La Haye du 5 février 2020 à propos d'un algorithme de lutte contre la fraude fiscale. Dans ces deux hypothèses, le juge a sanctionné d'abord en 2017 l'incapacité de l'administration à expliquer le fonctionnement de l'algorithme. Donc, il impose à l'administration de choisir des algorithmes accessibles aux justiciables. En 2020, il considère que le manque de transparence l'empêche de contrôler l'algorithme, l'empêche lui-même de contrôler l'algorithme. Il considère que pour Siri, donc pour cet algorithme, eh bien, il n'a pas pu contrôler si l'atteinte à la vie privée n'était pas disproportionnée par rapport à l'objectif de lutte contre la fraude. Et il ajoute même, concernant ce même algorithme de lutte contre la fraude fiscale, qu'il ne peut être exclu que le déploiement de l'algorithme dans certains quartiers sensibles entraîne une discrimination des citoyens dans ces zones. Deux éléments à ce sujet. Je voudrais juste revenir sur la philosophie de la proposition de règlement européen sur l'IA, donc qui a été adoptée par la Commission en 2021. Elle apporte une définition large de l'IA. Elle considère que les systèmes d'intelligence artificielle correspondent donc à des logiciels capables, pour un ensemble donné d'objectifs définis par l'homme, des résultats tels que du contenu, des prédictions, des recommandations ou des décisions influençant les environnements avec lesquels ils interagissent. C'est donc une définition très large. Et la conception donc de cette proposition repose sur la classification, sur une classification des algorithmes en fonction des risques. Il y a certaines utilisations d'IA qui sont tout simplement interdites parce que trop attentatoires aux libertés. Par exemple, les systèmes qui visent à priver les utilisateurs de leur libre arbitre, les systèmes de notation sociale, comme ils peuvent avoir cours en Chine, ou ceux qui prévoient l'identification biométrique à distance en temps réel dans les espaces publics. Ceux-là sont interdits. Sinon, il y a une certaine liberté d'exploitation pour d'autres utilisations d'IA parce que les risques sont acceptables. Mais entre ces deux pôles, il y a une zone, entre ces deux extrêmes, il y a une zone où il y a une grande variété de situations qui appellent des situations différentes. Quel impact sur les systèmes d'IA utilisés par les administrations publiques? Eh bien, 2 éléments peuvent être déduits de cette proposition de règlement. D'abord, l'utilisation de systèmes de reconnaissance faciale à distance en temps réel, c'est-à-dire par exemple la surveillance par drone dans les espaces publics à des fins répressives, est en principe interdite. Deuxième chose, les systèmes d'intelligence artificielle utilisés dans les services publics sont considérés comme étant à haut risque et ils sont donc soumis à des obligations strictes de transparence, de fiabilité et de traçabilité. Donc, pour résumer, les systèmes d'identification biométrique, comme les IA utilisés dans le cadre de services publics classés à haut risque, sont soumis à des obligations particulières d'évaluation ex ante, ex post, à des exigences de supervision humaine, de robustesse, de sécurité, d'exactitude et de qualité des jeux de données qui alimentent l'IA. Le texte, bien sûr, est à l'état de proposition et pourra donc évoluer. En tout cas, et ce sera ma conclusion, je crois qu'il serait tout de même opportun de se tourner vers l'expérience canadienne pour peut-être adopter un cadre juridique clair et protecteur des libertés fondamentales. L'idée du Canada, c'est de mettre en place un comité d'évaluation des incidences algorithmiques sur les décisions administratives avec une directive du 1er avril 2019. Je trouve que cette expérience serait intéressante à scruter de plus près parce qu'il propose une évaluation faite à toutes les étapes du déploiement de l'outil algorithmique, instaurant ainsi un contrôle plus transparent, plus démocratique pour éviter la dégradation du lien de confiance entre le citoyen et les autorités publiques. Voilà l'enjeu essentiel. Je vous remercie.
네, 프랑스 파리 낭테르 대학교 루시 클루제 메테이에 교수님의 발표 잘 들었습니다. 프랑스 법과 유럽 연합 법이 공공 서비스 알고리즘에 사용되는 데이터의 사용을 어떻게 규제하고 오늘날 AI 시스템을 어떻게 구성하고 있는지에 대해 말씀해 주셨습니다. 좋은 발표 감사합니다. Well, Professor Lucie Glizel-Métayer from the University of Paris Nanterre in France gave us a wonderful presentation titled Regulation of AI in the French Public Sector. And Professor Métayer mentioned how French laws and EU laws regulate the use of data utilized in public service algorithms and how they compose the AI system today. Thank you very much once again. 네, 그럼 이제 마지막 세션의 발표를 청해 듣도록 하겠습니다. 세 번째 세션의 주제는 바로 한국의 이용자 정책 방향입니다. Finally, let us begin our final session of the day, session 3, titled Korea's Approach to User Policy. 마지막 세션의 발표는 인간과 인공지능의 상호 공존 시대, 한국에서의 인공지능 기술에 대한 이용자 보호 접근의 특성을 주제로 건국대학교 황용석 교수님께서 진행해 주시겠습니다. And the final presentation of today's conference, titled The User Protection Approaches Toward the AI Technology in Korea in the Era of Mutual Coexistence Between Humans and AI, will be delivered by Professor Yong-seok Hwang from Konkuk University. And Professor Hwang is kindly joining us on site today. 네, 황용석 교수님께서는 오늘 친히 현장에 자리해 주셨는데요. 그럼 이제 마이크를 황용석 교수님께 넘기도록 하겠습니다. 여러분 큰 박수로 환영해 주십시오. Please welcome him with a big hand.
네, 안녕하세요. 세 번째 발표를 맡은 건국대 황용석입니다. 네, 마지막 발표군요. 네, 저는 한국 사례를 중심으로 해서 발표를 준비를 했습니다. 저희 제한된 시간이라서 조금 충분하게 설명이 못 되는 부분에 대해서는 나중에 질의응답 시간을 통해서 답변 드리도록 하겠습니다. 네, 국제적으로 앞서 여러 발표에서 나온 것처럼 인공지능 기술에 대한 다양한 법과 규범적인 접근들이 진행이 되고 있습니다. 한국 정부, 그다음 한국 사회, 또 한국의 민간 기업들 역시 이 인공지능 기술에 대해서 어떻게 이 규범을 설정하고 사회적 부작용을 최소화하고 또 한편에서 이용자 보호라고 하는 큰 인간 중심적인 설계를 할 것인가에 대한 논의들이 활발하게 진행이 되고 있습니다. 제가 오늘 말씀드리는 내용들이 이제 그런 내용들을 다 담지는 못하지만 대략적인 큰 방향들을 소개하는 데 주안점을 뒀습니다. 네, 한국에서 인공지능과 이용자 보호 이슈는 굉장히 여러 가지 맥락 속에서 어떻게 보면 여러 부처 또 방송통신위원회를 포함해서 여러 부처, 그다음에 여러 연구기관 그리고 다학문적인 접근 속에서 이 논의가 좀 비교적 풍부하게 논의가 진행되고 있습니다. 제가 지금 이 책을 한 권 이렇게 띄워놨는데요. 결국 이 소프트웨어 중심적인 사회가 오고 있다는 것을 말하는 책입니다. 마노비치가 쓴 이 책에서 보면 결국 소프트웨어가 새로운 21세기 이전의 문화유물들을 새롭게 생성하고 저장하고 배포하고 상호작용해서 사용하는 이런 새로운 어떤 물리적인 즉 전통적인 이런 또 물리적 형상을 갖고 있는 미디어를 대체하고 있는 이런 현상에 대해서 쓰고 있습니다. 소프트웨어가 중심이 되는 새로운 미디어 시스템, 커뮤니케이션 시스템이라는 것은 우리가 가져왔던 오랫동안의 즉 인쇄미디어가 보여져 왔던 책과 같은 물질적 형상의 미디어 시대가 점점 사라지고 있고 또 미디어 서비스, 커뮤니케이션 기술이라고 하는 것이 우리 머릿속에 일정한 전형적인 상들이 존재했었는데요. 바로 그런 것들이 사라지고 있다는 것을 의미하기도 합니다. 그래서 이런 인공지능 기술은 보이지 않는 기술 이렇게 표현해도 틀리지 않을까 싶습니다. 그리고 이런 굉장히 다양한 방식에서 이런 인공지능 기술의 진화가 빠른 속도로 일어나면서 이런 사회의 규범이나 제도와 이런 기술 간의 간극이 점점 커지고 있는 것이 우리가 지금 목도하고 있는 현상인 것 같습니다. 인공지능 기술이 전통적인 커뮤니케이션 기술 또는 미디어 기술과 좀 다른 것은 이것이 굉장히 범용적인 기술이라는 것입니다. 즉 모든 영역에 마치 스며들듯이 이 기술이 결합이 되면서 그런 결과에 의해서 다양한 이런 정책이나 이런 이론적인 영역에서의 연결고리들이 만들어지고 있습니다. 지금 여러분들이 보고 계시는 이 파워포인트 슬라이드에 보면 검색 애플리케이션에서부터 시작해서 콘텐츠를 수집하는 그런 애플리케이션, 그다음에 한다든가 필터링 한다든가 추천하는 시스템, 그다음에 콘텐츠를 제작하는 시스템 등등 굉장히 다양한 영역에서 이 인공지능 기술들이 널리 쓰이고 있습니다. 이것이 의미하는 바는 뭐냐면 과거에 특정한 도메인 기술로 즉 특정 분야의 기술로 사용되어 왔던 그리고 인식되어 왔던 이런 미디어 기술이나 커뮤니케이션 기술들이 범용적 기술로 전환되면서 한 축에서는 이런 경쟁법적인 논의, 또 다른 한 축에서는 전통적인 이런 방송과 또는 통신과 같은 이런 미디어 영역에서의 정책과 규범적 논의, 또 개인정보 보호와 관련되는 그런 법익적 논의들, 그리고 의료나 자동차와 같은 특정 산업 분야에서의 정책 논의 등등이 모두 이렇게 크로스하게 걸쳐지는 굉장히 광범위한 하나의 어떤 이런 학문적인 접합 영역들을 갖고 있다는 것이 특징이 되겠습니다. 그래서 이 각각의 영역과 독자적으로 이렇게 수직적으로 쭉 하나의 체인처럼 진행해 왔던 그런 학문 영역의 이런 규범 체계들이 어떻게 보면 인공지능 시대에 와서 하나의 어떤 보편적인 규범과 법칙의 형태로 좀 재구성될 수밖에 없는 그런 큰 장을 만들어 나가고 있는 상황입니다. 우리가 이제 인공지능 기술에 대한 논의를 이렇게 접근하는 것은 결국 이 기술로 인해서 나타날 수 있는 잠재적인 사회 현상, 또 한편에서는 이 기술이 이미 만들어낸 우리의 사회적 체제 속에서의 어떤 갈등 양상들로부터 이 논의가 본격적으로 출발됐다고 할 수 있습니다. 굉장히 많은 사례들이 있겠지만 크게 우리가 이것을 논의할 때 이런 알고리즘 또는 인공지능 기술의 이런 편향의 문제로 많이들 이야기하고 있습니다. 지금 이 표에처럼 이런 인공지능 알고리즘이 만들어지는 편향의 요인들이 굉장히 다양하죠. 편향으로부터 자유로운 인공지능 기술은 없다고 해도 틀린 말은 아닌 것 같습니다. 알고리즘 모델링 단계에서부터 의도적으로 특정한 목적에 의해서 차별적인 이런 계산 공식을 쓸 수 있고요. 또 알고리즘 자체가 갖고 있는 계산적 오류라든가 과정 파악 문제 같은 것들도 있을 수 있습니다. 그리고 데이터를 수집하고 처리하는 데 있어서 측정하는 데 있어서의 편향도 발생할 수 있고, 또 학습하는 데 쓰이는 입력 데이터 자체가 갖고 있는 부호의 문제라든가 이런 초기 학습 데이터의 어떤 편향 문제라든가 과대표본의 문제라든가 여러 가지 이슈들이 존재를 하고 있습니다. 그리고 경우에 따라서는 의도적으로 이런 편향을 만들 수도 있고 결과적으로 나타나는 편향도 존재하고 있습니다. 그래서 우리가 이런 인공지능 기술이 갖는 문제점을 이야기하는 것과 그 문제점의 원인을 탐지하는 것 간에는 상당한 갭이 존재하는 게 사실입니다. 왜냐하면 우리가 어떤 형태로든지 리버스 엔지니어링 기법이나 이런 것들을 쓰더라도 정확한 원인을 찾아내는 게 그만큼 어렵기 때문입니다. 그래서 아직까지 우리는 인공지능과 관련되는 이 기술에 대한 효과로서 나타나는 그 현상에 대해서는 많은 사례가 축적되기 시작했지만, 그러나 그것에 대한 원인을 설명하는 데는 학문적 수단이나 또는 어떤 정책적 개념적 수단 이런 것들이 여전히 부족한 것이 사실인 것 같습니다. 그리고 이런 기술이 사회 영역과 결합될 때 우리가 그것을 개념을 사용하는데 굉장히 어려움이 존재합니다. 대표적인 것들이 우리가 대학 입시 제도에서 농어촌 지역 학생들에게 특별한 입학 쿼터를 준다든가, 미국 같으면은 이제 소수 인종에 대한 쿼터 같은 것들은 사회적으로 합의된 그런 이제 정의에 기반한 그런 쿼터라고 할 수 있는데요. 이런 사회적으로 합의된 이런 공정의 영역과 실제로 수리적인 영역 간에서의 그 해석의 이해의 어떤 간극들도 존재하면서 실제로 이런 그 인공지능 기술에 의해서 나타난 이런 차별에 대한 문제를 해석하고 설명하는 데 있어서 상당히 많은 이런 문적 도구들과 어려운 논쟁들이 동반되고 있는 것도 사실인 것 같습니다. 네, 그 인공지능 알고리즘의 편향의 요인은 너무나 많기 때문에 그것으로 인해서 나타나는 이런 다양한 형식의 편향들이 여러 연구에서 지금 측정되고 있고 또 분류화가 되고 있습니다. 그리고 점점 복잡해지는 인공지능이 이제 만들어지면서 딥러닝 같은 경우는 사실상 이 편향의 원인을 역추적하는데 어려움이 존재하는 것도 사실입니다. 그래서 우리가 어떤 개발 사안, 어떤 문제화되는 사안에 대한 원인에 대한 접근, 그리고 그 원인을 통해서 사안에 대한 어떤 정확한 어떤 대안을 만드는 접근이 아니라 뒤에서 말씀드리는 것처럼 잠재적인 리스크, 우리가 발생할지 모르는 그런 위험 상황에 대한 하나의 어떤 등급과 범위를 설정한 다음에 자율 규제를 강조하는 방식으로 최근에 이제 유럽의 규제가 이렇게 만들어지고 있는데요. 한국도 좀 비슷한 접근이 있는 게 아닌가 싶습니다. 그래서 인공지능 관련된 이런 연구에서는 크게 서브젝트 주체 중심의 연구와 그다음에 이제 사람을 분류하는 것, 이게 이제 주체 중심의 연구가 될 거고요. 우리가 넷플릭스 같은 콘텐츠를 분류하는 것이 오브젝트 대상에 대한 연구라고도 할 수 있고, 또 그것을 대상을 이제 집단으로 늘리면 집단 공정성에 대한 연구, 이렇게 크게 세 가지로 분류가 되는데 이런 연구들이 지금 많이 진행이 되고 있습니다. 지금 제가 보여드리는 이 슬라이드는 2020년에 방송통신위원회가 진행한 사업의 일환이었고, 그다음에 이 행사를 주최하고 있는 키스디 정보통신정책연구원이 발주하고 제가 위탁 연구를 했던 과제입니다. 그 카이스트의 문수복 교수님이 같이 공동 연구로 참여를 해주셨고요. 앞서 말씀드린 어떤 대상 중심의 공식, 오브젝트에 대한 그런 공정성 연구라고 할 수 있고요. 가상의 데이터를 이용을 해서 전 처리 단계에서 입력 데이터의 불균형을 어떤 식으로 보정할 때 이런 것들이 편향이 어떻게 최소화되는가에 대한 알고리즘 비교를, 효과 비교를 한 그런 연구라고 하겠습니다. 물론 이제 그 가상적인 데이터였고, 무비렌즈라고 하는 실제 이제 영화 리뷰 사이트의 데이터를 가지고 임의의 알고리즘을 만들었는데, 이제 그 알고리즘을 가지고 데이터에 대한 보정을 통해서 나타나는 그런 편향 점수값의 차이를 봤을 때 효과가 나타나는 뭐 그런 것들을 알 수 있었습니다. 뭐 이건 어디까지나 하나의 사례에 불과하고요. 지금 한 측면에서는 이렇게 데이터 기반적으로 이런 편향의 문제를 조작적으로 정의하고 이 정의된 편향의 범위를 최소화하기 위한 다양한 방법론적인 시도가 한국에서도 이루어지고 있다는 그런 간략한 소개를 드리겠습니다. 그렇다면 우리가 갖고 있는 인공지능 기술에 있어서 이용자 보호에 대한 그런 영역별로 어떤 법익적인 갈등이 있는가를 살펴보겠습니다. 개인적 차원과 사회적 차원 그리고 경제적 차원으로 구분을 해봤습니다. 개인적 차원에서는 뭐 명예훼손이라든가 프라이버시 침해라든가 개인정보 침해와 같은 것들이 있을 수 있고요. 사회적 차원에서는 이런 사회적 차별 현상, 차별 대우, 그다음에 사실 이것이 이제 법익적 갈등으로 설명하기는 조금 애매합니다만 사회심리적인 효과가 있는데 대표적인 게 이제 에코 챔버나 집단 극화와 같이 사회심리적인 어떤 부작용 이런 것들을 낳는 논의들이 있고요. 그다음에 딥페이크와 같은 이런 허위 조작 정보와 관련된 요소가 있습니다. 그래서 이렇게 사회적 차원은 있고 경제적 차원에는 디지털 담합이라든가 뭐 불공정 거래, 차별적 지급이나 부당 고객 유인 행위와 같은 이슈들이 지금 한국에서 논쟁이 되고 있는 영역이라고 말씀드릴 수 있겠습니다. 첫 번째로 제가 이제 소개해드리는 것은 개인적 법익 영역에 해당되는 건데요. 지금 보시는 것처럼 네이버나 다음과 같은 한국의 대표적인 포털 사이트에서 구글과 같은 연관 검색어 또는 자동 추천 검색어가 서비스되고 있습니다. 그래서 이 서비스는 일종의 공발생 비율을 기반으로 해서 소비자가 검색어를 손쉽게 입력할 수 있게끔 하는 일종의 편의 서비스라고 할 수 있겠죠. 근데 여기 특정한 어떤 정치인의 이름이 있으면 그 정치인의 어떤 부정적인 키워드가 같이 연결이 될 때 이것이 자동화된 그 알고리즘에 의해서 구성됨으로 인해서 만들어지는 약간의 의미가 형성되는 측면이 있고 이것이 고유한 하나의 표현물적인 속성을 갖게 됩니다. 그리고 이런 것에 대해서 하나의 어떤 개인의 법익, 명예훼손과 같은 뭐 이것을 사실적시로 봐야 되느냐 전통적인 명예훼손처럼 그렇게 보기는 힘들 수도 있지만 이 연관 검색어를 넣어서 나오는 그 정보가 구체적이기 때문에 명예훼손으로 신고가 들어온 경우가 상당히 많이 있었습니다. 그래서 한국에서는 기소라고 하는 인터넷 자율정책 기구에서 이런 연관 검색어, 자동 완성 검색어에 대한 피해 구제 제도를 마련을 해서 공인이나 뭐 이런 공직자 등이나 또는 공적 관심사가 아닌 경우에는 노티스 앤 택다운 룰을 적용을 해서 요청했을 때 연관 검색어를 삭제해주고 있는 상황입니다. 그리고 제가 그 연구한 한 2년 전에 발표한 논문 중에 검색 알고리즘에 대한 이런 추천 검색어가 표현물적으로 어떤 특성이 있고 법적인 그런 어떤 쟁점은 뭔지에 대해서 미국과 유럽 법원에 관련된 판결문을 다 모아서 분석한 논문이 있는데요. 미국의 경우에는 이제 이런 검색 사업자가 추천 서비스를 통해서 연관 검색어를 보여주는 것은 표현물적인 것으로 법원이 보고 있습니다. 그래서 표현의 자유의 영역으로 간주를 해서 대체로 검색 사업자에게 표현의 자유의 일종의 보호 범위에 드는 것으로 봐주면서 면책을 많이 주는 그런 이제 결정이 많이 나왔고요. 유럽 같은 경우는 조금 다르게 이제 표현의 자유와 인격권 간의 이제 비교 형량을 좀 강조하고 있습니다. 그러면서 이 검색 알고리즘 자체가 기계적 과정에 불과하고 이것이 어떤 표현의 자유의 권리를 갖고 있다고 보지 않는 이제 유럽 법원의 특징이 있었고요. 그래서 그 연관되는 그 검색 결과물의 맥락에 따라서 유럽 법원은 좀 다른 결과를 내는 그런 것들을 저희가 이제 알 수 있었습니다. 그리고 그래서 이 이슈는 상당히 이제 한국에서는 자율 규제를 통해서 많이 피해 구제가 되고 있고요. 또 하나 이제 개인적 차원에서는 개인정보 침해 이슈가 있습니다. 이것은 한국에서 가장 잘 알려진 이슈이고 AI 로봇, 챗봇 로봇인 이루다라고 하는 이 로봇이 스캐터랩이라고 하는 회사가 이제 이 이루다 서비스를 이제 구축하기 위해서 여러 가지 이제 그 사적인 이제 체포 표현들을 수집을 해서 이것이 이제 성희롱 표현이나 인종차별, 사회적 혐오 표현 등을 일종의 이제 대응케하고 재형케함으로 해서 결국은 개인정보보호위원회가 이 AI 챗봇 로봇인 이루다 개발사에 1억 330만 원의 이제 과징금과 과태료를 내고 회사가 이제 사과를 한 바가 있습니다. 그래서 한국에서 가장 이제 주목을 받았던 개인정보 침해 사례인데 많은 이슈들을 남겼고 이것이 이제 이런 그 인공지능이 학습하는 데이터에 있어서 이런 그 비식별화의 문제를 포함해서 어디까지 해야 되는지 그리고 이 최종적으로 이런 표현물을 만들어낼 때 있어서의 규범의 영역 등등 많은 과제를 던졌다고 하겠습니다. 사회적 차원에서는 이제 딥페이크 기술인데 사실 기술 중립적 관점에서 보면 이런 딥페이크 기술들은 한편에서는 영화 제작 등이나 게임 제작에 많이 쓰이고 있습니다. 그러나 이것이 이제 그 목적이 기만적 목적으로 쓰이게 될 경우에는 상당히 심각한 이제 개인 또는 사회적인 이런 법익 침해가 되는데 제가 이런 연예인 사실은 이거는 개인적 법익 침해이기도 합니다. 왜냐하면 특정화된 연예인들을 내 얼굴을 학습을 해서 이제 성적인 영상물 포르노그래피 같은 걸 만들어서 지금 최근에 굉장히 많이 이제 방송통신심의위원회로부터 제재를 받고 있습니다. 그래서 K-팝 아이돌을 대상으로 한 딥페이크 성적 영상물이 있는데 이런 포르노그래피라는 관점에서 사회적 법익 침해 또는 사회적 차원의 권리 침해라고 표현을 했고 만약에 이 당사자가 고소를 했다면 개인적 법익 침해가 되겠죠. 네. 그리고 경찰청이 딥페이크 검거 사례를 발표하고 있고 상당히 많은 2021년 올해에도 이런 딥페이크 영상물들이 많이 유포가 되고 있다는 것을 이제 밝히면서 검거를 열심히 하고 있습니다. 그래서 한국에서는 이 성폭력 범죄 처벌에 대한 특례법 안에 딥페이크와 같은 이런 그 영상물에 대한 이런 자동화된 영상물에 대한 규제책을 집어넣습니다. 그래서 이것을 뭐 인공지능 규제법으로 말하기는 조금 그래서 여기다가 담았고요. 그 다음에 이제 가장 어떻게 보면 많은 논의가 있는 영역이 바로 이런 경쟁법적인 영역, 경제정책과 관련되는 영역이 되겠습니다. 지금 뭐 우리나라의 공정거래위원회가 이 네이버의 동영상 서비스가 부당 고객 유인을 했다라고 해서 시정명령과 가징금을 부과한 바가 있습니다. 플랫폼 사업자로서 네이버가 이런 쇼핑 동영상 분야에서 검색에서 자사가 더 우대되게끔 했다라는 것이 이제 쟁점이 될 거고요. 지금 현재 이것은 이제 행정법원에서 다툼을 벌이고 있는 사안이라서 조금 더 최종적인 이제 법원의 결정을 좀 봐야 될 것 같습니다. 여기 경제적 차원과 관련해서는 크게는 뭐 여러 이슈들이 있는데 뭐 킬러 어퀴지션이라 해서 뭐 잠재적인 경쟁 사업자를 인수하는 문제라든가 데이터 접근에 대한 방해라든가 멀티 호밍 차단이라든가 뭐 알고리즘 담합이라든가 부당 고객 유인과 같은 이런 여러 이슈들이 경쟁법적인 쟁점으로 다루어지고 있는데요. 지금 공정위가 지금 그 인공지능 기술 알고리즘에 대해서 적용했던 대표적인 것들이 이런 이제 부당 고객 유인과 관련된 사례가 한국에서는 가장 많이 축적이 되어 있는 상황입니다. 그리고 이제 뭐 기타 이제 유사하게 또 동일하게 부당 고객 유인으로 카카오 모빌리티, 그다음에 쿠팡과 같은 이런 거대한 전자상거래 중개 플랫폼에 대해서 마찬가지로 알고리즘 조작을 통해서 자사에게 더 유리하게 이런 자사 상품에 대한 배차를 했다라는 등등의 논의로 지금 공정위가 기업 조사를 하고 있는 상황입니다. 그래서 아직 뭐 담합과 관련해서는 국내에서는 디지털 담합에 대해서는 큰 사례가 없는 상황이고요. 그러나 이런 그 알고리즘과 관련된 경제적 차원에서의 이런 논쟁과 뭐 이런 권리 다툼 이슈는 앞으로 굉장히 많이 늘어날 것으로 예상이 됩니다. 이용자 보호적 관점에서 보면 한국은 굉장히 다양한 접근 방법, 특히 그 유럽의 모델들을 많이 좀 벤치마킹해서 진행이 되고 있습니다. 그래서 법률로 보면 공정거래위원회가 관련된 뭐 온라인 플랫폼 중개 거래의 공정화에 관한 법률과 그다음에 방송통신위원회가 제출한 이제 플랫폼 이용자 보호에 관한 법률 아닙니다. 예, 의원이 뽑아 제출이 됐습니다만 병합이 되고 있는 상태고요. 기타 이제 윤리 원칙이 이미 제시가 되고 있고 방통위의 인공지능 미디어 추천 서비스 이용자 보호 원칙과 기타 관계부처가 합동으로 한 인공지능 윤리 기준 등등이 나와 있는데 상당히 많은 기준들이 있어서 이 두 가지만 대표적으로 좀 소개를 했고요. 그 외에도 가이드라인이 있습니다. 이 가이드라인은 과학기술정통부의 온라인 검색 추천 알고리즘 투명성 가이드라인, 또 인공지능 신뢰성 가이드라인 등이 있고 사업자가 윤리 지식과 헌장 등을 발표하고 있는 상황입니다. 법률안에 대해서 짤막하게 말씀드리면 이런 공정위가 입법 예고한 온라인 플랫폼 중개거래 그 입법안인 거래의 공정화에 관한 법률에서는 이런 알고리즘의 순전한 노출 방식을 공개하게 하는 내용이 포함되어 있고요. 방송통신위원회와 관련된 온라인 플랫폼 이용자 보호에 관한 법률에서는 마찬가지로 여기에도 추천 등의 결정을 미치는 이런 노출 기준을 공개하고 개인화 여부에 대한 이용자의 자기 선택권을 강화하도록 그렇게 제시를 했습니다. 그리고 이제 방통위의 이용자 보호, 미디어 추천 서비스 이용자 보호 원칙이 발표가 됐는데 이 원칙의 특성은 뭐냐면 미디어 시스템이라는 용어를 붙였습니다. 그래서 방송통신위원회가 이 방송 분야를 포함한 이 미디어 분야에 대한 규제기관이다 보니까 이런 플랫폼 사업자의 미디어 추천 서비스에 있어서 이 반영되어야 되는 중요한 원칙들을 좀 더 좁혀서 특정화해서 했다는 것이 특징이라고 할 수 있을 거고요. 뭐 투명성, 공정성, 책무성과 같은 핵심 원칙과 함께 5가지 실행 원칙을 좀 제시를 했습니다. 근데 그 방통위의 이 이용자 인공지능 미디어 추천 서비스 이용자 보호 원칙의 가장 큰 특징은 앞서 디지털 미디어 플랫폼이라고 하는 그 영역 범위가 하나가 있을 거고요. 두 번째는 뭐냐면 위헌 기반적 접근을 이제 했다는 것이 가장 특징입니다. 그래서 미디어 영역 이런 이제 과학기술 영역에서 이렇게 그 어떻게 보면 플랫폼 사업자에 대한 위헌 기반적 접근은 처음 한 것이 아닌가. 그리고 앞서 해외 발제자들께서 해주신 것처럼 유럽의 인공지능 법안에서 다뤄졌던 그런 수준의 아주 세밀한 그 위험의 분류는 아닙니다만 이 리스크에 대한 그런 접근을 하면서 좀 더 유연한 접근을 했다는 게 가장 큰 특징인 것 같습니다. 과학기술정보통신부 등 관계부처가 만든 윤리기준의 경우에는 상당히 기본 원칙과 10대 핵심 요건 이런 것들이 굉장히 체계적으로 인문학 하시는 전공자들까지 철학하시는 분들까지 같이 참여하셔서 이런 인간 중심적인 이런 기본 원칙과 요건들을 설계했다는 것이 장점이고요. 이 한국의 이런 그 이른바 규범 설정, 원칙 설정은 이미 그 해외에 이미 발표되어 있는 다양한 국가 또는 민간 영역의 원칙들을 일종의 어떤 메타적인 분석을 통해서 또 한국적인 가치가 포함됐다는 점에서 전체적인 구조로 보면 국제적 기준과 크게 다르지 않고 또 나름대로 최신성을 갖고 있다라고 하겠습니다. 네이버나 카카오, SK텔레콤 역시 최근에 이런 그 규칙들을 계속 갱신해 나가고 있고요. 특히 카카오 같은 경우는 차별과 관련되는 그런 이슈들, 유럽에서는 차별에 대한 규제가, 차별이나 혐오에 대한 규제가 자연스럽지만 한국에서는 여전히 논쟁적인 영역인데 그런 것들을 사업자가 좀 더 적극적으로 반영했다는 게 큰 틀이겠습니다. 결국 이제 결론적으로 말해서 앞서 인공지능 기술이라는 게 모든 영역에 걸치는 법령 기술이고 특정 산업 분야 또는 우리가 그동안 뭐 파이프라인 경제에서 일종의 어떤 폐쇄적인 산업 구조 안에 적용되는 게 아니기 때문에 우리가 예상할 수 있는 잠재적인 권리의 갈등 양상이라든가 권리 침해 양상들이 굉장히 우리가 예측하지 못하는 굉장히 폭넓은 영역에 걸쳐 있습니다. 이렇게 법령적인 기술과 물리적인 정형성이 없고 끊임없이 재신화되고 문제의 원인을 설명하기 어렵다는 이런 특징을 보면 이런 법률에 의해서 세세하게 해서는 안 되는 내용에 대한 규칙을 설정하는 것보다는 원칙을 설정하고 그 원칙이 민간 사업자와 여러 가지 공적 영역이 협력을 통해서 자율적으로 수행될 수 있도록 만드는 그런 것들이 상당히 중요한 것이 아닌가 싶고요. 바로 그런 것들이 이런 어느 수준의 실행을 해야 되고 각각의 역할 분담을 어떻게 해야 되는가는 리스크의 수준에 따라 좀 달라지겠죠. 그래서 이런 그 위헌 기반적 규제가 어떻게 보면 한국에서도 좀 더 이런 세세한 법령 기반적 규제에서 조금 전환이 될 필요가 있다라고 생각을 하고요. 이 내용은 이미 앞에 발표에서 잘 설명이 됐습니다. 그래서 이런 위헌 기반적 규제 접근에 대한 논의들을 한다면 좀 더 유기체적이고 목적 중심적인 그런 접근 방식이라는 것을 우리가 좀 주목해야 되지 않나 싶고요. 그리고 규제 대상과 규제를 하는 그런 어떤 정부 부처 또는 뭐 입법자들 간에 있어서 상호작용을 끊임없이 하면서 우리의 어떤 규율의 영역과 규율의 수단들을 계속 바꿔나가야 되는 그런 특징들이 있습니다. 그래서 규제 패러다임에 대한 새로운 우리가 좀 설정들이 필요한 단계다. 다만 좀 모호한 부분이 있고 이런 이제 규칙 기반적인 접근과 비교했을 때는 불확실성이 분명히 존재한다고 하겠습니다. 그리고 이런 규제 프레임 전환을 하기 위해서는 여전히 우리 한국의 이런 규제 논의에 대한 전반적인 좀 재검토가 필요하겠고, 그다음에 타율 규제 중심의 한국적인 규제 논의를 좀 자율 규제를 활성화시키는 그런 방법으로 전환하지 않으면 우리가 이렇게 광범위하고 또 폭넓고 다양한 잠재적 사안들에 대해서 대처하기가 점점 어려워질 거라는 거죠. 그래서 위헌 기반 규제에 대한 자율 또는 공동 규제의 그런 전통들을 좀 만들어 나가기 위한 전반적인 다학문적인 논의, 그다음 민간의 노력이 필요하겠다. 그리고 유럽연합이 이런 그 인공지능 법안에 제시하고 있는 것은 약간 위험 수준에 따라서 승인적인 자율규제 모델을 설정하고 있다고 말씀드릴 수 있습니다. 그래서 결국은 그 주체는 자율규제라고 할 수 있겠습니다. 그래서 그런 측면에서 이런 위험에 대한 그 분류라든가 기술 개발 단계에서의 어떤 위험을 고려한 표준화된 규약의 개발이라든가 이런 것들이 이루어지면서 우리가 큰 틀에서는 정부는 원칙을 제시를 하고 그리고 자율적인 실천이 가능한 어떤 원칙 기반의 어떤 규약이 제시가 된다면 사업자들이 그런 원칙과 가이드에 기반해서 자체적으로 각각의 위험 수준에 맞춰가지고 이용자 보호에 맞는 실행 원칙들과 그다음에 내부적인 약관 또는 어떤 서비스의 관리 지침들을 만들면서 고위험과 낮은 위험에 각각의 다르게 이런 규제 수단들이 적용될 수 있는 그런 위험 수준에 따른 비례적 접근들을 우리가 해나가는 게 필요하지 않을까라고 생각됩니다. 네, 이상으로 제 발표를 여기서 마치도록 하겠습니다. 경청해 주셔서 감사합니다.
네, 건국대학교 황용석 교수님께서 인간과 인공지능의 상호 공존 시대, 한국에서의 인공지능 기술에 대한 이용자 보호 접근의 특성을 주제로 오늘의 마지막 발표를 들려주셨습니다. 다시 한번 감사드립니다. So Professor Yong-Seok Hwang from Konkuk University gave us the final presentation, which was very opportune. Thank you very much. 그럼 이상으로 5분의 발표를 모두 마치겠습니다. 지금부터 잠시 휴식 시간을 가진 후에 4시 55분부터 저희가 종합 토론을 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 그럼 저희는 잠시 후에 다시 인사드리겠습니다. So that concludes all presentations, and we are going to take a short break. And the panel discussion session, which is going to be the last segment of today's conference, will commence at 4:55 p.m. on the dot, Korea Standard Time. So please come back to your seat on time. Thank you.